Margaery Tyrell's bare feet pressed against the smooth stone of the balcony overlooking the lush gardens of Highgarden. The sweet fragrance of blooming roses enveloped her as the wind rustled through her hair. From this high vantage, the world felt still and agreeable, as though peace in the Seven Kingdoms had already been secured. Yet the hollowness that weighed on her heart these days was at odds with the beauty around her. She knew too well that beneath the surface, the realm simmered with uncertainty and ambition, and every step one took could be fraught with hidden dangers. She had grown adept at reading the signs that subtle politics left in the air, whispers carried through halls, the corners of letters that never made it to her eyes. Highgarden was a place of laughter and revelry, but as the daughter of Mace Tyrell, she had begun to see beyond the illusions of pleasantries and banquets. She looked down at a hand clutching the smooth stone balustrade. Her nails were trimmed and polished. That small detail, she realized, was one of the trifling habits she had maintained despite the tension in her soul. She used to believe that if she kept her outward beauty immaculate, it would be easier to command both hearts and minds. But now, the question arose more urgently than ever. Beauty to what end? She had been prepared once to wed the late King Renly Baratheon, a union of political convenience meant to secure Tyrell influence, that had ended in a swirl of sorcery and rumor, and his death had thrown House Tyrell's fortunes into doubt. Then came the short-lived betrothal to King Joffrey, and though that possibility vanished under as grim circumstances, Margaery had adapted quickly, pressing her advantage where she could. Even when she married Tommen, the gentle boy king, it was a matter of survival for her house in King's Landing. But now Margaery could sense a shift in the wind. The War of the Five Kings had torn the kingdoms apart, but the Tyrells, being pragmatic, had managed to keep themselves relevant at court. Their granaries fed the capital, their gold lined the pockets of many a courtier, and their presence, especially Margaery's, soothed a city ravaged by violence and sudden changes of power. Yet House Lannister had grown wary, and Cersei in particular had become an ever-present menace. Margaery's time with Tommen was overshadowed by the manipulations of the Queen Mother and the Faith Militant. She and her brother Loras had both felt the sting of captivity in the Great September. Though they had emerged, that episode left them all changed. Mace Tyrell had shown glimpses of fatherly worry, and Olenna Tyrell, that sharp-tongued matriarch, made her concerns known through scathing remarks about the Lannisters' competence. It was Olenna, in fact, who had first whispered to Margaery the name Daenerys Targaryen. At first, that name had seemed like part of some distant fantasy. The last living Targaryen princess across the sea, raising dragons, freeing slaves, gathering an army that could cross the narrow sea. But as tales of her exploits grew bolder, and as Varys's little birds began chirping more insistently, Highgarden's attention was drawn eastward. Margaery found herself reading every scrap of rumor or half-truth about the Dragon Queen. Some accounts praised her beauty, her youth, her bravery. Others painted her as a ruthless conqueror, a figure so enamored of her own sense of destiny that she would flame entire cities into submission. Margaery did not know which version was truer, only that the woman's ascendance could not be denied. The king in King's Landing no longer held the same aura of absolute power, not with the war in the north and the rebellious lords who had turned their backs on the Iron Throne. Each day seemed to bring fresh news of Bolton treachery, Frey betrayals, and the slow unraveling of any sense of unity in the realm. Yet amidst this chaotic scene, there was the silver-haired Targaryen with her dragons, a trifecta of unstoppable might. Sooner or later, Daenerys would land in Westeros, and all the lords and ladies would have to decide where their loyalties lay. Olenna, mindful of a strategy that might preserve Tyrell power no matter who sat the Iron Throne, began to speak of forging an early alliance with that distant queen. Margaery's mother, Allery, had her doubts, and Mace Tyrell, for all his pomp, was hesitant to do anything that might draw the wrath of the Lannisters again, especially after the fiasco with the Faith Militant. But Margaery listened closely to Olenna. She saw that as alliances in the Seven Kingdoms faltered, the prudent course might be to secure a new alliance beyond it. She had once courted the possibility of becoming queen by marriage, first with Renly, then with Joffrey, then through Tommen. Perhaps it was time to consider a different approach. The seeds of the plan were planted in hushed conversations held behind closed doors, at times only between Margaery and Olenna, at times with Mace's reluctant agreement. They all knew the key to House Tyrell's survival would lie in forging relationships that outlasted the faltering Lannister monarchy. Thus, it was decided that Margaery would secretly leave King's Landing, where she continued a polite but icy relationship with Tommen and Cersei, and returned to Highgarden under the guise of illness. There, the final details of her departure to Essos would be arranged. The route was perilous, but the risk might yield immeasurable rewards. The notion of Margaery Tyrell joining Daenerys Targaryen, offering her the wealth and granaries of the Reach, the cunning of the Tyrell bannermen, and perhaps something else, herself, was a gambit they believed could elevate House Tyrell to unprecedented heights. When the day arrived for her to set sail, Margaery stood on the docks of Old Town, attired in garments that would have made her unrecognizable to any prying eyes. Her hair was hidden beneath a plain traveling cloak, the Tyrell sigil replaced by a simpler crest on her carriage. Ser Tallad, one of her loyal knights, accompanied her, along with a small entourage carefully selected by Olenna for their discretion. Each carried provisions and letters meant to smooth her introduction to the court of Daenerys Targaryen. Margaery had read them a dozen times on the road from Highgarden to Old Town, memorizing the phrases of courtesy her grandmother had recommended. The sea voyage was long and uneventful in the beginning, the kind that lulled her into daydreams about a future in which she and Daenerys stood side by side, forging a new age for Westeros. She watched the horizon and imagined the taste of salty air blended with the heat of dragon's breath. But as the storms picked up near the stepstones, the ship lurched dangerously over rolling waves, and Margaery was forced to confront the immediate peril of the crossing. She clung to the ship's rail in the middle of one tempest, retching into the dark sea, her once elegant bearing shuddering like a reed in the wind. Yet she forced herself to remain resolute, telling herself that this was a trial of sorts. If she could not endure a storm at sea, how could she weather the fierce ambitions swirling around the Dragon Queen? When at last they sighted the coast of Essos, the sun was setting behind them in a haze of purple and gold, casting long shadows across the deck. Margaery forced herself to stand tall, to breathe in the brine, to recenter her mind. She was not here to be bested by illusions of grandeur or to cower before foreign warlords. She was here to secure the future of her house. The plan was to land near Volantis, then make their way east under the protection of a mercenary company that one of Olenna's agents had contacted. They would travel in discreet caravans, avoiding the main thoroughfares whenever possible. Margaery swallowed hard at the thought of leaving behind the safety of a Tyrell vessel for the uncertain roads of Essos, but there was no turning back now. Volantis was a city of teeming life, with great black walls dividing old and new, and the elephant and tiger factions vying for influence. The smells of spice, incense, and exotic animals assaulted her senses the moment she disembarked. Her retinue seemed equally overwhelmed, their gazes darting everywhere at once. But Margaery composed herself, offering an occasional courteous nod to curious passers-by. Thanks to Olenna's thorough planning, she had letters of introduction that soon brought her into contact with the promised mercenary escort, a gruff band with origins in Lys and the disputed lands, led by a man named Garin Belantis. He was tall, lean, with scarred cheeks that told many stories of prior battles. He was no knight, but Margaery did not need a knight. She needed a killer who would keep her safe, and he seemed capable enough of that. They set out for Meereen, as Margaery had learned that Daenerys had claimed the city as her seat of power. Along the way, she saw the ruins of old battles, shattered caravans, burned-out villages, and refugees trudging along the dusty roads with vacant eyes. The aftermath of slavery's downfall was not so simple, it seemed. Daenerys had unleashed a revolution in Slaver's Bay, but revolutions never passed quietly. It was one thing for Margaery to read about the Dragon Queen's liberation of slaves, quite another to see the consequences firsthand. Some refugees, newly freed, hailed Daenerys as a goddess. Others cursed her for the chaos and bloodshed that followed. Margaery listened carefully to their stories, gathering insight into the complexities of the woman she hoped to ally with. There was nobility there, but also a ferocity that made many cower. Finally, after weeks of travel under the glaring sun, beset by sandstorms and the occasional group of outlaws, Margaery's caravan approached Meereen. From a distance, the city's great pyramid rose like a colossus, flanked by walls that glimmered in the midday heat. Her heart quickened at the thought of meeting Daenerys Targaryen. Would she be as formidable as her reputation suggested? Would she be willing to treat with a highborn lady from Westeros? Or would she dismiss the Tyrell claim to greatness? Margaery knew that, more than anything, she had to present herself not just as a mere supplicant but as a representative of a great house, a prospective partner. At the city gates, the unsullied guards, stoic and perfectly disciplined, inspected their group. Margaery noticed the unwavering manner in which they stood, each posture identical, their hands on spears. There was an otherworldly aspect to them, something more reminiscent of moving statues than men. Yet she treated them with the same courtesy she might show a Westerosi lord, for they were Daenerys's chosen protectors. They let her pass once she declared her purpose and presented a sealed letter. She'd prepared for every possibility, including the chance that Daenerys might refuse her entry. But to her relief, the guards took her group into the city after only a brief delay. Meereen was alive with swirling aromas of sizzling meats and pungent spices, hawkers shouting in markets, children running barefoot through narrow alleyways. The architecture, foreign and imposing, held a sense of grandeur that was all the more impressive for its strangeness. At the heart of it, the Great Pyramid loomed, and her escort led her there, eventually handing her off to attendants in pale attire who guided her inside. The corridors echoed with distant footsteps, and the air was noticeably cooler than the scorching avenues outside. Margaery was given fresh water to drink and a basin in which to wash her hands. She was instructed to wait in a receiving chamber. She waited there for what felt like an hour, though it might have been less. The tension in her limbs made time slow. She found herself going over every phrase she might say, every courteous bow she might employ. She wondered if Daenerys would demand she kneel, or if she would invite her to sit. Then the double doors opened, and Margaery rose to her feet. A slender woman with long silver hair stepped through, Daenerys Targaryen. She wore a gown of white and gold, cut in the style of the Eastern courts, and though she was shorter than Margaery had expected, she radiated an intensity that caught Margaery's breath. Flanking her were two figures, a man with a noble bearing and an even expression that matched the descriptions Margaery had heard of Ser Barristan Selmy, once a Kingsguard in Westeros, and a tall, imposing figure with shaved head and dark skin, armed with a spear, presumably one of Daenerys's most trusted unsullied captains. Daenerys regarded Margaery with keen violet eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm but tinged with curiosity. "You come from Westeros," she said, and though it was plainly a statement, Margaery inclined her head in acknowledgement. "I do, your grace," Margaery replied in a measured tone, letting the courtesy of your grace ring clear, so there would be no doubt she recognized Daenerys's regal claim. "I am Margaery of House Tyrell, daughter of Lord Mace Tyrell of Highgarden, and I bring greetings from my family and a proposal." She could feel Daenerys's gaze moving over her, evaluating. There was a moment of silence, and Margaery realized that this was her cue to explain her presence. She took a small, deliberate breath. "We have heard of your conquests, of the freedom you have given to the people of these lands. We have also heard that you intend to return to Westeros. My house, we have endured many trials of late, and we believe that our future, and that of Westeros, may hinge on welcoming a new monarch. One who would bring peace and justice, and yes, perhaps the might of dragons." Daenerys studied her more closely. "I have fought many battles here, Lady Margaery, and I have seen the consequences of war. I do not seek it for Westeros, but I will not hesitate to bring it to any who oppose me. Why would a great house such as yours come to me, secretly and without fanfare?" Margaery allowed a faint smile. "Because my grandmother, the Lady Olenna, and I see clearly that the Iron Throne is crumbling under the weight of the current rulers. Lannister influence has weakened, and many lords are questioning their loyalties. As for the House Baratheon line, well, it is in disarray, split among distant claimants and overshadowed by Lannister gold. We do not believe King Tommen can hold the realm together for long, especially not under his mother's regency. If we wait until you land your armies on the shores of Westeros, it might be too late to extend our friendship in a way that truly benefits both of us. We wish to do so now." From the corner of her eye, Margaery saw Ser Barristan glance at Daenerys, as though in quiet appraisal of her reaction. The Dragon Queen drew herself up slightly, an imperceptible shift in posture. "I have not forgotten how the Tyrells supported the usurper Robert Baratheon," Daenerys said at length, "nor that they backed Renly and then sided with House Lannister when it was convenient. You must understand my caution." "Yes," Margaery conceded, dipping her head. "My house has done what it thought best for survival, as any great house would. But times are changing, Your Grace. My father and my grandmother are not fools. They see the rightful queen, and moreover, they see a chance for a new way forward, free of the old hatreds and grudges. We would secure our place at your side, give you the breadbasket of the Reach to feed your armies when you come, give you gold and men to bolster your cause. In exchange, we ask that you remember our loyalty and return our lands, and perhaps more, intact once you sit upon the Iron Throne." There was a pause, and Margaery sensed a shift in Daenerys's manner, an understanding. "A pragmatic alliance," Daenerys murmured. "I have need of such alliances. And, for you, Lady Margaery, does ambition factor into this? Do you seek a crown yourself?" Margaery chose her words with care. "I have worn the crown of a queen consort already, if only briefly. I learned what it means to rule or to attempt to rule in King's Landing. I know the burdens, the trappings, and the dangers. My ambition is to see my family thrive, to see the suffering in the realm eased. And if I may stand as your ally or your friend, I would do so proudly. I do not seek to supplant you. I only wish for the stability and prosperity of my house and the Reach." Daenerys studied her in silence, and Margaery wondered if she could sense the sincerity in her words, or if she doubted them. Finally, the Queen stepped closer, extending her hand. Margaery instinctively curtsied, though she maintained eye contact. Daenerys's palm was warm, her grip firm. "Then let us begin by sharing truths," Daenerys said, her voice lighter, almost a smile gracing her lips. "We will speak further in my council chambers. I will hear your terms, and I will share mine." Over the next days, Margaery found herself invited to court gatherings within the Great Pyramid, albeit in a modest capacity at first. She observed Daenerys presiding over supplicants, handling matters of trade, punishment of local insurgents, negotiations with former slaveholders. Margaery saw that Daenerys did not shy away from severity when needed, but also saw the compassion that had earned her the adoration of the freedmen. In the evenings, Daenerys would speak more privately with Margaery, sometimes with Ser Barristan present, sometimes with her entourage of advisors, the witty dwarf called Tyrion Lannister, whose presence was an unexpected surprise for Margaery, though she recalled how he had vanished from King's Landing after killing his father Missandei, the graceful translator and occasionally Grey Worm, who represented the Unsullied's discipline and perspective. Margaery discovered that Tyrion harbored no warm love for Cersei or the rest of his family, though the mention of Jaime occasionally elicited a bittersweet expression. He, in turn, found Margaery's presence among Daenerys's court curious, and teased out details of her plan during late-night cups of wine. "Your house is playing a dangerous game," Tyrion had commented dryly, "but the Tyrells have always been cunning, even if your father is, well, your father." Margaery only laughed softly, acknowledging the truth of it. She and Tyrion shared stories of King's Landing's intrigues, and each gleaned fresh insight. Margaery grew to admire Daenerys's unwavering sense of purpose. She saw in the young Targaryen queen an echo of the grit and determination she herself had needed to survive in King's Landing. They were both women who had navigated treacherous terrains, Daenerys in the deserts of Essos, Margaery in the viper's nest of the Red Keep. During one of their private conferences, Margaery proposed the beginnings of a formal alliance. The Tyrells would pledge themselves to Daenerys in exchange for the promise that upon taking the Iron Throne, she would recognize the Tyrells as wardens of the South, free from Lannister overshadowing. Additionally, Margaery's suggestion implied a deeper bond. A queen's bloc, as she styled it. An idea of two powerful women standing side by side, reshaping the realm's politics and social order. Daenerys listened with a mix of intrigue and caution. "I have been advised many times that I should seek a husband for a political marriage," she said, her voice reflective. "They have told me a queen cannot rule alone. And have you considered that perhaps you do not need such a marriage?" Margaery asked quietly. "Men will say anything to ensure they retain influence. But you are the mother of dragons. You have armies. You have dragons. You should unite the realm under your banner. But that does not mean you must wed any man who mes courting. If alliances need to be forged, there are many ways to forge them." Daenerys regarded her, something flickering in those violet eyes that could have been understanding or even amusement. "You speak boldly, Margaery Tyrell. I have heard that you were well-schooled in the arts of persuasion, but this is new to me. The notion of a queen's bloc, as you call it. It suggests a shared regency." Margaery lifted her chin. "I would not presume to claim co-rulership over the Seven Kingdoms, if that is what you mean. But I propose a partnership that is not reliant on the old structures. You would still be the ultimate authority, Queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, protector of the realm, but House Tyrell's loyalty would be unwavering. We would speak as one voice on major matters, with the same goals in mind." She paused, aware of how daring this might sound to one raised in a lineage of conquerors. "I do not bring dragons, but I bring something else. The second most fertile and wealthy territory in Westeros. I bring the breadbasket and the loyalty of many lords who trust my family. Your claim might be unstoppable with them under your banner. And you would not have to share your bed with someone you might despise simply for the sake of forging alliances." Daenerys leaned back, letting the words linger in the candlelit chamber. "It is an appealing idea," she admitted, "but I must think on the ramifications. Westeros has never been ruled by two queens. The lords might bristle at the thought." "They will bristle regardless," Margaery said with a knowing smile. "So you might as well shape the realm into something that benefits you. They will come to accept your power, and if they see that the Tyrells, a long-standing and respected house, acknowledge it, they will be less inclined to resist. Perhaps one day, if you choose to marry, you will do so on your own terms, not because you are desperate for support." In the following days, the city of Meereen buzzed with rumors. Though their conversation remained private, the presence of a highborn Westerosi lady among Daenerys's inner circle ignited speculation about what might be brewing. Margaery was careful to remain poised, graciously meeting the gazes of the freedmen and former slaves who stared at her with curiosity. She was not blind to the cultural differences, nor to the resentment some Meereenese harbored toward any Westerosi influence. She strove to show them respect, to keep an open ear for their stories and plights. Daenerys, too, introduced her to certain freedmen councils, letting her witness firsthand the challenges of governing a city that had only recently thrown off the shackles of a brutal institution. At one such council, Margaery listened as a freedwoman complained about the retribution killings that still took place at night, the sons of the Harpy taking vengeance on those who had risen against them. Margaery observed the difficult balance Daenerys had to strike. Too harsh a crackdown, and the entire city might revolt. Too lenient, and the freedmen might be slaughtered in secret. Margaery offered a suggestion. A more formalized patrol system, overseen by the Unsullied, but assisted by local watchmen who had proven their loyalty. This would ensure that the city felt it was participating in its own protection, rather than simply being policed by foreign soldiers. Daenerys seemed intrigued by the idea and asked for details. Over the next several sessions, Margaery found herself helping to draft a basic framework for integrating local watchmen. While the success of this would remain to be seen, it was a small mark of progress, a sign that Daenerys was open to counsel and recognized Margaery's knack for administration and diplomacy. In private, Tyrion teased Margaery, calling her a natural politician. She took it as a compliment. Ser Barristan, on the other hand, observed her quietly but would occasionally nod in approval when she made a compelling point. Missandei was kinder, offering Margaery translations when needed and bridging the cultural gap with a warm smile. The more time passed, the more Margaery felt she was weaving herself into the tapestry of Daenerys's court. And so came the day when Daenerys summoned her to the private balconies at the top of the Great Pyramid. The sun was high, the reflection of its rays dancing on the bay below. From this vantage, the ships in the harbor were no more than tiny triangles on the shimmering water. Daenerys stood near the edge, the wind whipping her silver hair about her face. Her posture was calm, regal. She glanced at Margaery as she approached. "I have considered your proposal," she began, turning to face her fully. "If the Tyrells truly wish to support me, I will accept their aid. But I will have certain conditions." Margaery nodded, folding her hands in front of her. "Name them, Your Grace." "First, I want your father's official pledge in writing, bearing the seal of Highgarden. I want it sent to me here in Meereen, acknowledging me as the rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms and ensuring that when I sail for Westeros, the Tyrell bannermen will rise in my name. Second, I want Highgarden to open its granaries to my fleets when they land, ensuring that my armies, and the common folk we liberate, will not starve. Third, I ask that you remain here with me, to continue what we have begun, to stand as the living promise of House Tyrell's loyalty. I will, in turn, pledge to protect the Reach from retribution once I claim the Iron Throne, granting it certain privileges under my reign." Margaery weighed these demands. They were significant, but not unexpected. She had already come prepared to commit House Tyrell, though she knew it would take time for her father to be convinced fully. Olenna's support would be crucial. The mention of Margaery remaining in Meereen was a subtle test of her dedication. She suspected Daenerys did not want her returning to Westeros, only to be swayed or coerced by the Lannisters or any other rival faction. In truth, Margaery did not relish the idea of being so far from her homeland, but she had come too far to shrink from sacrifice now. "I believe my father will comply, especially with the support of my grandmother. We can draft the necessary letters. As for me remaining here, I will do so gladly so long as we remain in regular contact with the Reach. They must know that I am well and that our alliance stands." Daenerys nodded. "You shall have a raven ship from Volantis every fortnight, if you wish. Or we can arrange other means of communicating, possibly through Varys, who always seems to have ways of sneaking messages across the sea. But there is more, Lady Margaery." Daenerys paused, stepping closer. "You spoke of a Queen's Bloc, a new way of doing things. I find the idea compelling, and I would have you counsel me as we move forward. If we are to reshape Westeros, let us start by shaping the way we lead here in Meereen, to show our people that we bring not just fire and blood, but a better future." A thrill of triumph rippled through Margaery, though she kept her face demure. "It would be my honor, Your Grace," she said. "Together, we can show them that there is more to leadership than fear." Daenerys turned her gaze to the open skies. "Fear can be a powerful tool, but I will not rule through terror alone. My ancestors conquered with dragons, but they also forged alliances and bonds that persisted for centuries. I will need allies who understand the hearts of the people I mean to rule. You have a gift for that, Margaery Tyrell." Margaery dipped her head. "I have tried, where I could, to ease suffering in King's Landing. I shall do the same here, for as long as you require it. And I will work to ensure the Reach stands firmly behind you when you set sail. You shall not want for bread, nor for flowers, nor for coin." They clasped hands in a silent agreement, two women poised to reshape continents. For the first time in many months, Margaery felt a sense of genuine hope. Not the forced optimism she had worn like a mask in King's Landing, but a brighter, bolder conviction that something good might come of all this, the forging of a new age. Word soon traveled through Meereen's corridors that the Lady Margaery of House Tyrell had pledged herself and her house to Daenerys Targaryen. The freedmen debated what this meant, some voicing hope that Westeros might likewise be freed of tyranny, others rolling their eyes at the thought of more aristocrats. But the common sentiment was that Daenerys was gathering strength for her inevitable return west, and Margaery's arrival was yet another sign of that. Tyrion joked about the blossoming Queen's Bloc whenever he shared a meal with Margaery. Over cups of strong Meereenese wine, he told her, You've just proven what I've always suspected, that half the lords and ladies of the Seven Kingdoms wouldn't know an alliance from a pail of spiced wine. But you do, and that makes you dangerous, which is why our queen is wise to have you on her side." He smirked, raising his goblet. "To dangerous women, may they rule the world better than men have." Margaery, with a wry grin, raised her goblet as well, but there was a seriousness in her eyes when she answered, "The world would be a better place indeed, but it will not come easily, not with Cersei Lannister still clinging to power." At the mention of Cersei, Tyrion's expression hardened. She will not relinquish that power quietly. Even Tommen, sweet boy that he is, cannot hold her back forever. Margaery felt a flicker of concern. "I worry for my family still in Westeros. My father and grandmother can look after themselves, but my brother Loras, he's recovering from wounds and shame inflicted by the Faith Militant. With Cersei's ascendancy, I shudder to imagine what new horrors might befall him." Tyrion shook his head. "Your father, for all his faults, knows how to keep troops around to protect those he loves. And Olenna, well, the Queen of Thorns is not one to be underestimated. She'll protect Loras until you return. But mark my words, the next months will be crucial. If Cersei senses betrayal, she might strike the Reach before Daenerys sets foot in Westeros." Margaery's mind raced. She knew the Tyrell forces were strong, but so was the Lannister army, and they had the advantage of being in King's Landing. If it came to open war before Daenerys arrived, the casualties would be high, and the farmland of the Reach might be burned in retribution. She resolved to expedite the formalities of the alliance, to send word back that the Tyrells must prepare their defenses without making their intent too obvious. Another delicate dance, but one she had been trained to manage since she was a girl. Over the ensuing weeks, Margaery remained in Meereen, working alongside Daenerys to quell the last embers of revolt by the Sons of the Harpy. They instituted new city watch patrols, created a transitional council of freedmen and moderate former masters, and oversaw the distribution of grain shipments throughout the city. Margaery's presence was a curiosity, but her diplomatic approach helped to defuse tensions. She organized feasts for the freedmen, reminding them that Daenerys had their best interests at heart. She listened with genuine care to the plight of orphan children. Gradually, some of the hostility toward the foreign Westerosi lady softened, replaced by grudging respect. Meanwhile, Daenerys continued to solidify her hold on Slaver's Bay, aided by the growing fleet in her harbor. She had not yet unleashed her dragons in open warfare again, but their presence served as a constant reminder of her power. On more than one occasion, Margaery caught sight of Drogon, the largest of the dragons, wheeling overhead with a terrifying grace. She felt a primal awe stir within her, and she realized that no one, no king, no lord, would stand easily against such might. Amid this near-daily work, Margaery and Daenerys's personal rapport deepened, though both remained aware of the tenuous lines between them. Daenerys was queen, Margaery her ally and advisor, but there were moments of shared laughter over a quip from Tyrion, a private conversation about the tragedies they had each endured in King's Landing. Margaery had never had a friend her own age with equal status. Sansa Stark, for instance, had been naive and frightened, a bird trapped in a cage. Cersei had been an adversary, too suspicious to ever allow real intimacy. Even her relationships with her brothers were steeped in the hierarchical norms of a noble house. With Daenerys, though, there was a sense of parity, two young women who had navigated labyrinthine dangers for the sake of their survival and the futures they envisioned. This bond did not mean they were immune to mistrust. Both had grown used to betrayals, but it meant that each recognized qualities in the other that mirrored her own. Thus, the concept of a queen's bloc transformed from a mere political arrangement to something more tangible. The first true test arrived when word came of Yunai's renewed hostility, as certain factions within that city-state plotted to reinstate slavery. Tyrion's intelligence suggested that envoys from Yunai were hiring mercenaries to raid Meereen's trade routes. The wise move might have been to send the Unsullied to crush those enclaves preemptively, but that risked launching another protracted war, draining Meereen's resources and risking a resurgence of chaos in the city. In council, different opinions abounded. Grey Worm favored a decisive strike, a show of strength. Tyrion advocated for carefully placed bribes and the fostering of internal dissent in Yunkai, so that the city would be too embroiled in its own troubles to bother Meereen. Daenerys listened, her lips pressed tight in thought. Then she turned to Margaery. "You have a knack for reading hearts. Tell me, what approach would you advise? How would the Tyrells handle such a threat?" Margaery cleared her throat. "The Tyrells in Westeros have long known that sometimes it is better to starve an enemy of resources and allies, rather than crush them outright. Conserves one's own strength. However, you must also appear strong, or you invite bolder attacks. Perhaps dispatch a small force of Unsullied along with a diplomatic envoy to remind Yunkai that you have not forgotten their earlier submission. Make them realize you can destroy them if you choose. Simultaneously, have your spies encourage divisions within their city, so that any rebellious group finds itself isolated. That way, you maintain the upper hand while also conserving your forces." Daenerys nodded slowly, a balance of fear and cunning. It may well be the best solution for the time being. In the days that followed, Daenerys heeded that advice, sending a contingent of Unsullied commanded by Grey Worm to meet with Yunkish leaders under the banner of parley, but accompanied by an implied threat. Meanwhile, Varys' networks and Tyrion's contacts sowed quiet dissent among the wealthy families in Yunkai, urging them not to provoke the Dragon Queen's wrath. The gambit proved effective. Rather than rally to open warfare, the city's factions turned against each other, with moderate voices calling for caution. Soon, the threat of immediate raids on Meereen's trade routes diminished, and Daenerys' authority remained intact. As the crisis passed, Daenerys commended Margaery's insight in front of the council, heightening her status further. Margaery, for her part, accepted the praise graciously, aware that every success she notched in Essos further cemented the standing of House Tyrell in the eyes of this new queen. Back in Westeros, events did not stand still. By raven and by rumor, Margaery learned that Cersei's hold on King's Landing tightened. Jaime Lannister had returned from the Riverlands, forging a reluctant truce with the Freys, while the North was in tumult under the Boltons' precarious rule. The Ironborn, led by Euron Greyjoy, were reported to be at large, and the Sand Snakes in Dorne were raising their own brand of havoc. In the Reach, Mace Tyrell nominally remained loyal to the crown, but subtle signs indicated he was preparing for conflict. Olenna Tyrell, likely far more than her son, took the lead in forging hidden alliances and ensuring the highways were guarded. Letters arrived for Margaery bearing Olenna's seal, sometimes with coded messages that only she could decipher. The gist was always the same. The Reach was prepared to rise for Daenerys when the time came. But caution was necessary, for the Lannisters were not fools, and their spies abounded. Olenna congratulated Margaery on her continued good work with the flower, a pun on the blossoming alliance with the Dragon Queen. Margaery read those letters with a small smile, hearing her grandmother's sharp wit echo from across the sea. Time swam by in a haze of negotiations, small crises in the city, and further bond-building between the two queens. Daenerys' dragons grew larger each day, occasionally causing small stampedes of panic when they soared over the outskirts of Meereen. Still, under Tyrion's guidance, the city's economy showed signs of revival, and trade flourished once more. Freedmen began to set up small shops, artisans found new markets for their wares, and the roads grew safer. Margaery recognized that this success was fragile, dependent on Daenerys' continuing stability. If another city in Slaver's Bay rose against her, or if some new threat emerged, it could all come undone. But for now, hope blossomed. That tenuous peace was shattered by a sudden arrival. Emissaries from the Iron Fleet, led not by Euron Greyjoy but by Yara Greyjoy and her brother, Theon. They came seeking Daenerys' favor, offering ships if she would support their claim to the Salt Throne. Margaery remembered Theon vaguely from King's Landing years ago, a ward of House Stark, though she had never spoken to him at length. He seemed thinner, haunted by some terror. Yara, however, was sharp-tongued and brash, making no apologies for her ambition. In a dramatic presentation before Daenerys' court, Yara explained that their uncle Euron planned to forge his own alliance with Daenerys by offering more ships, along with a marriage proposal if necessary. But Yara had beaten him to Meereen, hoping Daenerys would side with her. Margaery stood beside Daenerys during this audience, watching how the Queen weighed the Greyjoy siblings' offer. Tyrion asked probing questions, trying to discern if they could be trusted. Eventually, it was agreed that Daenerys would support Yara's claim against Euron, provided that the Ironborn cease all raiding and piracy upon Daenerys' ascension to the throne. Yara bristled at the notion of curtailing the Ironborn's way of life, but she grudgingly accepted, for her uncle's threat was too great to ignore. Daenerys, in return, would gain the ships needed to finally cross the Narrow Sea. After the feast celebrating the pact, Daenerys took Margaery aside. There was a kind of fierce glee in her eyes, an excitement that glowed like embers. "We are close now, Margaery," Daenerys said. "With the Iron Fleet and soon additional ships from Pentos that Tyrion has arranged, we will have enough to transport our armies to Westeros." Margaery felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment they had been working toward. "Then the time has come?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daenerys nodded. "Soon. We must finalize a few more matters here. Ensure Meereen will remain stable in our absence. But the wind blows toward Westeros now. I will bring my dragons, my Unsullied, my Dothraki, and we will see if the realm is ready for us. And House Tyrell will stand ready," Margaery vowed. "Let me send word to my family at once. When you land, the banners of the Reach will fly for you. The Lannisters will not find the road safe, and the small folk will not offer them bread. You will find a grateful people, Queen Daenerys. They are weary of war, but they will accept a liberator." Daenerys placed a hand on Margaery's shoulder, a gesture of genuine warmth. "I could not have asked for a better partner in this, Margaery Tyrell. I am glad you came to me when you did. The realm, I believe, will one day be grateful as well." Two queens forging a new beginning. Margaery smiled, her heart lifting. She could almost see it. A transformed Westeros, with Daenerys on the Iron Throne, dragons overhead but not raining terror, House Tyrell tending the fields and blossoming once more. If they succeeded, it might bring an era of peace unlike any the Seven Kingdoms had known. If they failed, the cost would be unimaginable. Yet in this moment, under the flickering torchlight of Meereen's balcony, with the salt air drifting in from the bay, Margaery allowed herself to believe that the future might indeed be bright. Preparations for departure gathered momentum. The pyramid was abuzz with scribes drafting edicts and trade agreements, with unsullied captains organizing rations, with Dothraki blood riders itching to cross the sea. Theon and Yara directed their sailors to load the ships, while Tyrion managed the logistical nightmare of ensuring enough food and water for the voyage. Margaery assisted in every way she could, drafting letters for her father and grandmother, detailing the timeline of Daenerys' arrival and advising them on how best to coordinate with the new queen's forces. She urged them to keep her brother Loras safe from any Lannister reprisal in the meantime. Daenerys would leave a portion of the Unsullied behind under the command of a trusted lieutenant, to maintain order in Meereen, along with some Dothraki who had grown fond of the city's fighting pits. The Freedmen's Council would continue to rule in Daenerys' absence, with Missandei offering oversight and guidance. A single dragon, Regal, would remain circling the skies above the bay to dissuade any opportunistic invaders. Thus, Daenerys ensured that her hard-won city would not simply collapse the moment she left. At long last, the fleet set sail. Margaery stood on the deck of a Tyroshi merchant ship refitted for Daenerys' court. The queen herself perched near the prow, the wind sweeping her silver hair in dramatic waves. Beside them flew Drogon, black scales shining in the sunlight, carving arcs across the sky. On the horizon, other ships spread out in a grand armada, the Iron Fleet, the ships from Pentos, mercenary vessels hired by Tyrion, and the smaller crafts of the freedmen who volunteered. The journey across the Narrow Sea was no small undertaking, but spirits ran high. The Dothraki hooped from the decks, eager for new lands to conquer. The Unsullied stood stoically by the riggings, dutiful and unyielding. Margaery felt a tug of homesickness and excitement mingle in her chest. She was going home, but with a new queen, a new cause, and perhaps the power to change everything. On calm days, she and Daenerys strolled across the deck, discussing strategies for landing. Margaery advised hitting the southern coasts near Dorne, forging an immediate alliance with the Martells if possible, then marching north through the Reach, consolidating the Tyrell and Dornish forces before moving toward King's Landing. Tyrion favored a more direct strike at the capital, decapitating Cersei's regime, but Daenerys was cautious of a siege that might cost many innocent lives. Eventually, they agreed upon a plan of landing in Dorne, where Ellaria Sand, though she had her own brand of ruthlessness, would likely support the Targaryen cause for vengeance's sake, and from there negotiating safe passage through the Dornish mountains, up into the fertile lands of the Reach. At night, Margaery would sometimes find Daenerys alone on the stern, gazing at the moonlit sea. She would join the queen in silence, a silent testament to the union they had forged. Each woman carried her own set of scars, her own burdens, but they shared an understanding of what power could mean for those who had none. Eventually, Daenerys would retire to her cabin, and Margaery would find her own, filled with letters and documents needing her attention. She scarcely had time to rest, but it felt invigorating rather than exhausting, a sense of destiny unfolding. When the fleet at last neared the southern coastline of Dorne, a scout ship brought word of alliance from the Martells. Ellaria Sand and her daughters had seized power after Prince Doran Martell's death, claiming to act in the name of justice. They expressed readiness to welcome Daenerys, though Margaery noted that the letter's tone suggested caution. They were the sort of people who might shift allegiance on a whim if it suited them. Nonetheless, it was a start. The fleet anchored near Sunspear, and Daenerys' arrival was met with a carefully staged reception. The Dornish lords, or what remained of them after the Sand Snake's purges, lined the approach to the castle, flanked by palm trees swaying in the desert wind. Ellaria greeted Daenerys with flowery words, calling her the rightful queen and praising her as the savior of Westeros. But Margaery, standing behind Daenerys, could sense the tension beneath the surface, the duplicity that lingered in Ellaria's eyes. Nonetheless, Daenerys accepted the hospitality with grace. The Dothraki, many of whom had never seen the coasts of Westeros, disembarked with a mixture of awe and brash excitement. The Unsullied swiftly established a perimeter. Tyrion began discussing strategy with Ellaria's counselors, while Grey Worm directed the unloading of supplies. Margaery took a moment to soak it all in, stepping onto the sands of her homeland for the first time in months. The air smelled different here, the dryness of the Dornish climate mixing with the salty tang of the sea. She thought of Highgarden's rolling hills and gardens, of the sweet smells of rose and honeysuckle. She was close now, so close to bringing Daenerys' cause to the heart of the Reach. She prayed that her father and grandmother had prepared the roads, that the banners were ready to be raised the moment Daenerys' army crossed their borders. In Sunspear's Great Hall, Daenerys and Ellaria discussed the route north. Margaery was invited to weigh in. She unfurled a map of southern Westeros and traced a path from Sunspear through the Prince's Pass or the Bone Way, explaining that each route had its advantages and perils. The Bone Way was narrower, easier to defend or ambush, while the Prince's Pass was broader but might expose the army to bandits or hidden loyalists of the Lannisters. Eventually, they settled on the Prince's Pass, as it was more conducive to the Dothraki's preferred style of mounted warfare. Ellaria pledged Dornish outriders to help screen the advance. Ellaria's daughters, the Sand Snakes, eyed Margaery warily. The tall and swift Obara, the cunning Nymeria, and the youthful Tyene. Margaery could feel their gazes upon her at every turn, as though weighing whether she was truly loyal to Daenerys or just another power-hungry noblewoman. Margaery did not let it rattle her. She responded with politeness, a soft smile, and a readiness to cooperate. She knew how to navigate the hostility of would-be rivals. She had learned that in King's Landing. Yet she also knew that for the sake of Daenerys' campaign, she needed the Sand Snakes on their side. So she flattered them mildly, praising their fighting skills and their devotion to avenging Prince Oberyn. They did not melt into cheerful friends, but their frowns lessened, and that was enough for Margaery to consider it a small victory. Within days, the combined forces began their march. Columns of Unsullied marched with military precision, flanked by rows of Dothraki screamers on horseback. Dornish cavalry ranged ahead, scouting the twisting roads. Daenerys rode near the front with a small retinue, Tyrion, Grey Worm, Missandei, and Margaery among them. Drogon flew overhead, occasionally joined by Rhaegal and Viserion, who had been transported by ship. The sight of 3 dragons crossing the Dornish sky was enough to unnerve any would-be foe. Town after town offered no resistance. Many peasant folk simply gawked at the dragons or the foreign soldiers, muttering prayers that no harm would come to them. Here and there, travelers bearing sigils of House Martell joined the procession, cheering for Queen Daenerys. Margaery remembered that the Targaryens had once been allied with Dorne through marriage. Perhaps the common folk still harbored some nostalgia for that. Or perhaps they simply saw the writing on the wall. No one wanted to face dragons in open battle. When they approached the borders of the Reach, Margaery's anticipation soared. She recognized the shape of the hills, the color of the soil. She guided Daenerys to a vantage point from which the green expanse of her home lay visible, dotted with vineyards and fields of grain. The Tyrell banners were not yet raised, but Margaery could almost sense them waiting, like seeds ready to burst into bloom. The next morning, a Tyrell outrider appeared at the camp, bearing a letter sealed with Mace Tyrell's sigil. Margaery's heart hammered as she took it to Daenerys. The letter welcomed the Dragon Queen to the Reach, declared House Tyrell's support, and invited her army to cross unopposed. Mace Tyrell assured Daenerys of safe passage and provisioning. "We stand with you, your grace, in recognition of your rightful claim," the letter read in part, "and we eagerly await the day you assume the Iron Throne." Daenerys looked up from the parchment, her eyes gleaming. "It is done, then," she said softly. "House Tyrell is mine. With their support, King's Landing will tremble." Margaery exhaled in relief. "Shall we march on Highgarden first, so that you may meet my father and grandmother?" Daenerys glanced at Tyrion, who nodded. Yes, it would be prudent to solidify the alliance in person before moving on King's Landing. The Queen agreed. "And I have always wished to see the famed gardens of your ancestral seat, Margaery." Margaery smiled. She could picture that meeting vividly. Olenna's sharp tongue, Mace's blustering hospitality, Daenerys's measured grace. It might be the crowning moment of their pact. "Then let us proceed, your grace." So the great host continued forward, crossing the official boundary into the Reach. At first, the lands seemed nearly deserted. The local peasants must have fled or hidden in their hamlets, uncertain whether this was friend or foe. Gradually, though, Tyrell bannermen in green and gold surcoats emerged, leading small companies to join Daenerys' army. Ser Talbot Beesbury, Ser Devran Fossaway, and others, knights who had once dined with Margaery in Highgarden, now lined up to swear fealty to the Dragon Queen. Each oath was one step closer to cementing the Queen's Bloc that Margaery had envisioned. They approached Highgarden on a warm afternoon. The sun lit up the castle's pale walls, and the surrounding fields were bursting with bright flowers. Reds, yellows, and pinks. For Margaery, it was a sight so familiar it brought tears to her eyes. She could see the orchard groves, the rose gardens, the gently sloping lawns where she had once strolled in luxurious gowns. Now she returned at the head of a foreign army, riding beside a Targaryen queen who commanded dragons. She could scarcely imagine what the small folk thought, but she hoped that soon they would see the blessings this new alliance could bring. Trumpets sounded from the castle walls, and the great gates swung open. Mace Tyrell himself rode out with a column of armored knights, his proud belly encased in gilded plate, a wide smile on his face. Beside him rode Olenna Tyrell in a carriage, her expression hidden behind a delicate wimple, but Margaery knew her grandmother's eyes were taking in every detail. They halted before Daenerys' entourage, and Mace dismounted, bowing deeply before the queen. Olenna inclined her head in a measured gesture of respect. "Your Grace, welcome to Highgarden," Mace Tyrell said in a jovial voice. "We are honored beyond words to receive you. You have made a fine choice in making alliance with my daughter." Daenerys reined in her horse, her posture regal as she addressed him. "Lord Tyrell, Lady Olenna, I thank you for your hospitality. I come in peace to forge a new future for Westeros. Your daughter, Margaery, has proven herself invaluable to me, and I look forward to working with House Tyrell in ending this troubled time in our realm." Olenna Tyrell's gaze flicked to Margaery, a hint of approval crossing her face. "The realm needs you, your grace," she said, in a voice that betrayed neither fawning nor false humility. "And we Tyrells are not blind to that fact. May our roses forever bloom under the light of your dragons." Tyrion snorted softly at that poetic turn of phrase, but Margaery just smiled, recognizing her grandmother's subtle flourish. They entered Highgarden in a grand procession, Daenerys at the forefront, the Tyrell banners flanking her, and Margaery riding slightly behind and to the left, a position suggesting both her high rank and her support of the queen. The small folk cheered, though some did so uncertainly, still wary of the Dothraki horsemen and unsullied foot soldiers marching behind. Yet no swords were drawn in hostility, no bloodshed tarnished the green fields. In the courtyard, servants hurried to offer bread and salt, reaffirming the sacred guest rite. Once inside the great hall, Margaery guided Daenerys to the dais, where 2 seats had been prepared. Margaery stood near the queen, while Mace and Olenna took their positions. Tyrion, Grey Worm, and Missandei clustered nearby, along with key Tyrell retainers. Speeches were made, toasts proposed, pledges renewed. Daenerys spoke with eloquence of her desire to bring justice and prosperity. Olenna, carefully measured, responded with half flattery, half challenge, as was her way. Mace, flushed with pride, boasted of the might of Tyrell arms, which drew an exasperated look from Olenna but did not deter Daenerys's gracious response. In a side chamber, after the ceremony, Margaery finally embraced her grandmother, feeling the older woman's wiry strength. "You've done well," Olenna murmured. "I was half ready to believe you'd been devoured by dragons." Margaery chuckled. "Daenerys is not as bloodthirsty as the rumors claim. She can be fierce, yes, but she seeks a better kingdom. I truly believe we've found the right path." Olenna's voice turned serious. "Let us hope so, child. For if this fails, if the Lannisters crush us now, it will be no small cost. But I trust your instincts." She glanced through the open doorway toward Daenerys, who was speaking quietly with Tyrion. "She seems formidable, that one. The realm might benefit from a strong hand on the throne, so long as it remains tempered by reason. You will see to that, yes." Margaery touched her grandmother's hand. "I will, grandmother. You have my word." Thus, the Queen's Bloc, long whispered and carefully orchestrated from across the sea, took firm shape under the vaulted ceilings of Highgarden. From that day forward, the Tyrell standard flew side by side with the Targaryen banner, the Golden Rose and the 3-headed dragon. News traveled swiftly across the Reach and beyond, sending ripples of fear through King's Landing. Cersei Lannister would soon learn that Margaery Tyrell, the once queen consort she had so cruelly tried to subjugate, had forged a new alliance with the Mother of Dragons. A wave of gossip, rumors, and half-panic speculation began to fill the taverns and keeps of the realm. 2 queens, joined in purpose, about to descend upon the capital with dragons, armies, and the greatest agricultural might in Westeros. All the while, Margaery stood near Daenerys, an equal in counsel if not in title, and saw the seeds of her earlier vision come to bloom. It had taken cunning, sacrifice, and no small amount of resolve, but finally, a powerful block of queens was poised to shape the destiny of the 7 kingdoms. The final test, toppling the Lannisters and uniting the realm, still lay ahead, fraught with the perils of war and the unpredictable nature of alliances. But as Daenerys and Margaery exchanged a glance in Highgarden's sunlit courtyard, both felt the stirrings of triumph on the wind. They were no longer 2 separate powers, but a single formidable force. And if the rest of Westeros resisted, it would soon learn just how potent the blossoming union of a rose and a dragon could be. At Highgarden, the festivities stretched long into the evening, and although it was billed as a welcome celebration for Daenerys Targaryen, the gathering served a deeper purpose. Lords and ladies from the Reach, small wonder that Highgarden was so full, with the entire countryside abloom in curiosity, thronged the great hall to catch a glimpse of the famed Dragon Queen and to see for themselves that Margaery Tyrell had returned not as a meek consort but as an equal partner in a new coalition. Torches cast flickering shadows across the vaulted ceilings, and their light danced over the lavish tapestries portraying triumphs of House Tyrell. Minstrels played soft harp music in alcoves, and servants passed among the crowds offering goblets of arbor gold and sweet mead, while the fragrance of fresh roses perfumed the air. Margaery drifted among the attendees, greeting them with light touches on their arms, murmuring courtesy and reassurance that all would be well. The Tyrell bannermen had heard fragments of rumor. Dragons in Dorne, unsullied foot soldiers marching across southern Westeros, a Targaryen alliance forging behind closed doors, and now that Daenerys stood openly in Highgarden, they faced the reality that the world was changing rapidly. Many lords seemed starstruck by Daenerys. Some were clearly awed by her regal bearing and the near-mythic presence of her dragons. Others studied her with guarded expressions, as though measuring how best to serve or exploit this new power. Margaery was careful to offer each one a few kind words, a promise that House Tyrell and the Dragon Queen wished only to see the prosperity of the Reach continue. In truth, Margaery's mind swirled with a dozen concerns. She and Daenerys had officially sealed their alliance, but open war had not yet been declared. Most of the realm knew that the Targaryen claimant had landed, and that the Tyrells were entertaining her, but how many realized that the entire southern half of Westeros would soon mobilize against the Lannisters? How many realized that King's Landing was effectively surrounded to the east and south? And how would Cersei respond once she learned that her erstwhile daughter-in-law now stood poised at the head of a massive army? Margaery felt a knot tighten in her stomach at the thought of Cersei's rage, for she knew the Queen Mother would stop at nothing to maintain her hold on Tommen and the capital. One did not lightly cast aside a Lannister, not without inviting bloodshed. Despite the risk, a strange energy kindled in Margaery, the same sense of possibility that had buoyed her spirits throughout her journey in Essos. She caught Daenerys' eye across the hall, where the Queen was accepting a toast from Ser Devran Fossaway. The corners of Daenerys' mouth curved into a small smile, and Margaery returned it. They needed no words to acknowledge how far they had come. Once, they were strangers bound only by rumors, but now they were co-rulers in SPI. Writ, forging a future that might reshape the entire continent. If they succeeded in taking King's Landing without destroying it, and if they then managed to govern better than the last few kings, the realm might know peace at last. Olenna Tyrell lurked near the dais, sipping wine that she had pointedly declared less than ideal. She beckoned Margaery over with a curt nod, as if summoning her for a conference. Margaery slipped through the throng and joined her grandmother, who wasted no time. "The lords are charmed as expected," she said in a measured tone. "But they will want promises. The Tarleys, the Oakhearts, the Rowans. These houses will march under our banner, but only if they are sure we'll protect their lands from Lannister raids. They also want reassurance about how taxes will be levied once Daenerys takes the throne. And I suspect many are curious if there will be new titles or positions of influence for them." Margaery nodded, scanning the room. Randall Tarley was nowhere to be seen. He was off in the northern part of the Reach, perhaps mustering men near Horn Hill. But Margaery knew Tarley was a formidable commander and no friend to House Lannister after the fiascos of the recent wars. "We'll have to offer them firm guarantees," Margaery said. "We can't have them second-guessing when the time comes to march. As for taxes, well, Daenerys wants to ease the burdens on the small folk, but we can't simply upend generations of feudal practice overnight. We'll need a measured approach, perhaps a transitional arrangement, with crown taxes reduced but lords still collecting their usual dues from their own domains." Olenna arched an eyebrow in grudging approval. "Yes, something along those lines might keep them mollified. You may wish to talk to Tyrion Lannister as well. He'll have ideas about how to structure the crown's finances without bankrupting the realm. Say what you will about that family. Tyrion is cunning in the ways of coin." Margaery's eyes flicked toward where Tyrion stood speaking in hushed tones with Missandei. He was gesturing with his wine cup, likely explaining some witty anecdote about King's Landing's labyrinthine politics. Margaery made a mental note to discuss the Lord's concerns with him later, for she knew he was intimately acquainted with the crown's debts and the realities of paying for wars. Meanwhile, Daenerys fielded a series of formal introductions at the dais. Lady Alice Beesbury curtsied in a gown of pale yellow, praising Daenerys's magnificent presence. Sir Talbot Beesbury followed, stiff and proper in half-plate, speaking words of loyalty. Next came the Hightowers of Old Town, though in partial representation. The actual Lord Leighton Hightower rarely left his high seat, so a younger son had come in his stead. Margaery couldn't help but notice how that man's eyes widened at every mention of dragons. The entire evening proved to be one of polite fawning mixed with genuine awe, underscoring for Margaery the precarious line each house had to walk. If Daenerys truly succeeded in ousting the Lannisters, they stood to gain new favor in the reformed court. But if the campaign failed, they would face Lannister vengeance. As the feast gave way to dancing and polite conversation, Margaery guided Daenerys into a small side room where a grand window overlooked Highgarden's famed rose gardens, illuminated by torches. A trickle of harp music drifted in from the hall. They stood there, away from prying ears, while Tyrion, Missandei, and Ser Barristan Selmy joined them to discuss the next steps. Olenna soon glided in as well, leaning on her cane as though the festivities had drained her, though Margaery suspected she was as keen-eyed and sharp-tongued as ever. Daenerys turned to the group. "We have a moment's peace, so let us talk strategy. How soon can we press on King's Landing, and what stands in our way?" Tyrion swirled the wine in his cup, his expression pensive. "From here, it's only a matter of weeks, if not days, to reach the outskirts of the capital, assuming the roads remain clear. But we need to consider supplies, the readiness of our forces, and the possibility of ambush. Cersei will likely send out watchers and outriders the moment she hears we're on the move. She might even dispatch Gregor Clegane or other fearsome captains to raid our baggage trains." "Have we heard any word from Storm's End?" Daenerys asked. "Stannis Baratheon is dead, so that line is finished. But do we know which lords in the Stormlands might support us?" Margaery and Olenna exchanged glances. Olenna spoke first. "Many of the Storm Lords who rallied to Renly eventually bent the knee to the Lannisters out of necessity, especially after the Tyrells joined the Lannisters. However, times have changed. House Cairn of Nightsong, House Penrose of Parchments. They might be persuaded to rise for you, given the right incentive, especially if they trust the Tyrells. But that would require sending envoys. That takes time." Daenerys nodded, her expression thoughtful. "A mass defection in the Stormlands would weaken Cersei's flank. But I don't wish to be delayed in our approach. The longer we wait, the more time Cersei has to fortify the city and harm the small folk inside." Tyrion drank deeply and then set his goblet aside. "One pressing question. Do we lay siege to King's Landing if the gates do not open, or do we attempt a direct strike? Remember, there's wildfire hidden beneath parts of the city. My father stockpiled it. The Mad King had caches of it. Cersei might use it. A full-scale assault could lead to catastrophic loss of life." Daenerys's lips pressed thin. "I will not reduce King's Landing to ash. Not unless there is no other choice. We saw what happened in Meereen when the city turned into a battlefield. We cannot let that happen to the heart of the Seven Kingdoms." "If we surround them," said Margaery, "we might force a quick surrender if the city's resources are cut off. But that depends on whether the city's inhabitants have the heart to hold out for long, and whether we can prevent smuggled supplies from coming in. King's Landing is large, and much of its grain has historically come from the Reach and the Riverlands. If we hold the roads from the south, we can starve them into submission within weeks." Tyrion nodded. "Yes, and the sea route might remain open, unless we can blockade Blackwater Bay. We have the Iron Fleet with Yara Greyjoy, which might suffice, assuming Euron Greyjoy isn't lurking out there with a larger navy." Daenerys looked to Grey Worm, who stood quietly by the door, his face impassive. "Grey Worm, how soon can the Unsullied be ready to march?" Grey Worm's voice was calm and certain. "In 2 days, Your Grace. We are always prepared." Olenna shook her head with a dry smile. "I imagine your Dothraki friends would say they are already prepared." Daenerys allowed a slight smile. "Yes, the Dothraki are eager, but I want to ensure we leave Highgarden with its defenses intact. If we march the entire army north, the Lannisters or their allies might try to strike here from another direction. Margaery thought of the vulnerable farmland. We should leave a garrison. A portion of the Tyrell forces will remain, along with some Dothraki outriders. That way, if there's a sneak attack from the west, Highgarden will not be caught unawares. They debated small details, from the number of wagons to how many ravens should be sent ahead with demands for surrender. Margaery listened keenly but felt a growing tension in her chest. The approach to King's Landing would be the first test of the Queen's Bloc on Westerosi soil. If they stumbled, it could unravel all the alliances they had painstakingly built. If they succeeded, it would confirm Daenerys as a force unstoppable, and Margaery's role in forging that victory would elevate House Tyrell's stature to heights unknown. Eventually, Daenerys ended the discussion by declaring that in 2 days' time, the majority of the army would depart Highgarden and move north on the Rose Road. Yara Greyjoy and her Iron Fleet would circle the southern coast, hugging the coastlines near Dorne and the Stormlands to approach Blackwater Bay. They would coordinate with the main force, setting a blockade if necessary. Olenna offered to keep watch in Highgarden, although Mace Tyrell blustered that he should be the one to command the men at the castle. Olenna swiftly cut him down with a pointed remark about not wanting to see him repeat the fiascos of the war with the Faith Militant. Margaery, Tyrion, Grey Worm, Missandei, and the bulk of Daenerys' forces would continue with the Queen herself. In the days that followed, Highgarden buzzed with preparations. Dothraki horsemen galloped back and forth through the fields, testing the local terrain. The Unsullied drilled with perfect discipline in the courtyard, their spears rising and falling in unison. Tyrell knights added the Targaryen sigil to their banners, painting the three-headed dragon next to the golden rose. Margaery took time to oversee supply wagons, ensuring that enough food was packed for the column. As she strolled among the clamor, servants bowed, and minor lords nodded respectfully, each more convinced than the last that she had the Queen's ear. She tried to spare a moment to see her brother Loras, who had been recuperating in private rooms since his ordeal under the Faith Militant. When she found him, he was in the rose garden behind the castle, leaning on a cane, his once lustrous hair shorn short. He was studying a bright yellow bloom with a distant look in his eyes, as if he found it both comforting and tragic. Margaery approached softly, placing a hand on his arm. "Loras," she said, "you're out of bed. That's good to see." He glanced at her with a slight smile, though he did not bother to hide the haunted expression in his eyes. "Sister, I never thought the day would come when I'd be grateful for a quiet garden. But after that cell in the September, this is paradise." She squeezed his arm gently. "You're safe now. I'm sorry for everything that happened in King's Landing. If we had acted sooner." He shook his head. "No, I was the one who insisted on trying to keep up appearances. I was the Knight of Flowers, remember? I thought my reputation could withstand anything. But the Faith Militant were ruthless, and I was less than what they wanted me to be. They broke me, Margaery." She swallowed hard, fighting tears. "They did not break you. They scarred you, yes, but you're still my brother, still a Knight of the Reach. You can find new purpose." He looked away, exhaling a shuddering breath. "I see you, standing beside Daenerys Targaryen, forging alliances with the mightiest army in the world. Meanwhile, I can barely stand without a cane. I suppose I'll not be riding into battle at your side. But if there's anything else I can do, some counsel, some letter you wish me to write, say the word." Margaery pressed her lips together. "Just focus on getting stronger. I'd rather you stay here in Highgarden, rest, recover. Grandmother and father will need someone they trust to help manage things while I'm away. And once Daenerys takes the throne, who's to say you can't serve as Lord Commander of her Kingsguard if you wish it?" He released a tired laugh that held a trace of bitterness. "The Kingsguard or Queensguard, to be precise. Maybe. But first I need to be able to run 100 yards without collapsing." "You will heal," Margaery said softly, leaning in to press a kiss to his brow. "Time and rest. Promise I'll return. We'll make sure that all the horrors of the last few years haven't been in vain." They lingered a while among the roses, speaking in low tones, reminiscing about their childhood and the carefree days before they were plunged into the lethal politics of the capital. When at last Margaery left him to continue her duties, she carried with her a renewed sense of resolve. She would not allow the Lannisters or the Faith Militant or any other force to trample what was left of her family. If forging a queen's bloc with Daenerys was the key, then she would see it through no matter the cost. Morning dawned bright on the day of departure. Horns sounded throughout Highgarden's courtyard, summoning knights, soldiers, and servants to their ranks. Horses snorted, wagons creaked, banners snapped in the breeze. Daenerys, mounted on a pale silver mare, wore the leathers of a Dothraki rider over a regal black cloak embroidered with subtle dragon motifs. Her silver-gold hair was braided behind her, and she carried herself with quiet authority. Margaery stood beside her, perched on a fine mare of her own, wearing a traveling gown of deep Tyrell green but without the lavish adornments she might have once favored. This was a campaign, not a courtly pageant. Still, she allowed herself a golden rose clasp at her shoulder, a nod to her house. Olenna and Mace Tyrell watched from the steps, flanked by Loras and a small entourage of courtiers. Olenna's stern face did not soften until Margaery rode up to exchange a last word. "Travel safely, my dear," Olenna said. "Try to keep that Queen of Dragons from burning down half the realm before she even rules it. And do come back in one piece." Margaery smiled, leaning down from the saddle. "I'll do my best on all counts, grandmother. Watch over Loras. Make sure he rests." Olenna sighed. "I will. Now go, before your father starts another round of pompous farewells." Indeed, Mace Tyrell was already halfway through an enthusiastic speech about the glories of House Tyrell and how they would stand with their new queen. Daenerys inclined her head courteously, but her eyes drifted toward the horizon, suggesting she was ready to depart. The horns sounded again, and the massive host began to march, with the Dothraki riding in columns to the flanks, the unsullied and rigid blocks, and the Tyrell knights scattered among them. Enormous wagons rattled along, loaded with grain, water barrels, tents, and other provisions. Drogon soared overhead, a black silhouette against the morning sky, while Rhaegal and Viserion glided behind, their screeches echoing. As they moved north, the Rose Road stretched out before them, winding through rolling farmland dotted with small villages. Word spread quickly that the Dragon Queen and her host were passing. Some peasants rushed to line the roads, bowing or offering baskets of produce in tribute. Margaery made certain that the soldiers did not harass or seize goods from the small folk without payment. Daenerys insisted on that as well, mindful of how she wished to be seen as a liberator, not a marauder. They advanced steadily, unchallenged. The banners of House Tyrell escorted them, and the few local lords who had not yet pledged approached with guarded courtesy, each convinced by the presence of dragons and the unstoppable tide of armed might that resistance would be futile. Some joined the march, swelling the numbers further. Others stayed behind to defend their keeps, but they did not raise arms against Daenerys. By the 5th day on the road, rumors began to filter in that Lannister outriders had been spotted near the Blackwater Rush, possibly preparing to mount raids. Tyrion frowned over maps in the command tent, pointing to areas where the terrain might favor Lannister ambushes. Daenerys, Margaery, and Grey Worm conferred with him, deciding how best to avoid or counter such threats. It was agreed that the Dothraki were best used to sweep the countryside for Lannister scouts, while the Unsullied remained the disciplined backbone of the main force. Margaery also sent a raven to Yara Greyjoy, urging her to hurry north with the Iron Fleet. If the Lannisters tried to ferry troops across the Blackwater Bay and strike the camp from the east, Yara's ships might intercept them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the army made camp near a shallow bend in the Mander, Margaery wandered among the tents, ensuring everything was in order. She found Daenerys outside a small command pavilion, gazing at the river's golden sheen as the last rays of daylight illuminated the water. Dany's posture was pensive, her face half in shadow. Margaery could guess the queen's thoughts. Tomorrow would bring them closer to King's Landing than either had dared dream not so long ago. Margaery approached quietly. "Are you all right, Your Grace?" she asked. Daenerys glanced at her with a soft smile, though tension flickered in her eyes. I'm just thinking about what it will mean to finally see the Red Keep. My father's seat, where the Mad King held court, where Robert Baratheon seized the throne. I was just a child when we fled across the sea. I never saw it with my own eyes, only heard stories from Viserys or Ser Jorah or others. But now I return, not as a fugitive, but as a conqueror. Margaery studied the queen's profile, the determined line of her jaw, the slight tremor in her hand. She gently placed her own hand atop Daenerys's. You don't have to be as your father was. You can bring more than conquest. You can bring justice, fairness. That is why we're here, isn't it? Daenerys inhaled sharply and nodded. It is, but part of me wonders if I've inherited the worst of my bloodline. Sometimes, I can feel the fire in my veins, urging me to unleash the dragons on my enemies. I know how that story could end. Margaery squeezed her hand. We temper each other, you and I. You have the power of dragons, but you also have a heart that beats for the common folk. And I have the knowledge of how to rule from within the system, how to weave alliances, how to feed people in times of crisis. Together, we won't repeat the mistakes of the past. Daenerys looked at her then, gratitude clear in her eyes. I believe you. Thank you, Margaery. Margaery smiled softly. Come, we should rest. Tomorrow will be another march, and soon enough we may encounter Lannister forces. Best face them with a clear head. That night, the camp settled into an uneasy hush. The Dothraki lit small fires and passed around bowls of spice stew. The Unsullied stood silent sentry along the perimeter. Tyrell knights huddled in groups, whispering about what might await them. In her own tent, Margaery laid on a cot, half lulled by the chirp of night insects along the mander. She found her thoughts wandering to Tommen, the boy king who had once been her husband. What would become of him if Daenerys took the city? She hoped Tommen would be spared. Perhaps he might abdicate peacefully. Perhaps he would be allowed to live out his days in some quiet keep. She knew Daenerys would not want to harm him if it could be avoided. But Cersei would likely not let him give up the throne so easily. Within a few days, the first real confrontation came. A mounted scout returned at a gallop, reporting Lannister outriders ahead, near a bend in the Rose Road that passed through a narrow valley. The terrain there was flanked by wooded slopes, ideal for ambush. Daenerys called the war council to order, and Tyrion quickly surmised that the Lannisters might have a few hundred men, possibly hidden among the trees. The plan was set. The Dothraki would circle around the ridge, come down from above, and cut off any attempt at retreat, while the Unsullied continued marching steadily in formation, ready to meet and attack head-on. Meanwhile, a small detachment of Tyrell knights would remain with the baggage train, ensuring no Lannister raiders slipped behind them. Shortly after midday, the army reached that valley. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp leaves. A hush fell over the marching ranks. Margaery rode near the front, her senses keyed for any sign of movement. Daenerys was slightly behind her, flanked by Grey Worm and Ser Bar. Yston, who had donned his old armor for the occasion, determined to protect his queen. Tyrion stayed with the rearguard, not being much of a rider or fighter. The first arrow flew out of the trees, whistling past the vanguard before plunging into the earth. A second followed, striking the shield of an Unsullied soldier. Then, as though a hidden signal had been given, a volley of arrows rained down from the slopes. Unsullied shields rose in unison, forming a testudo-like barrier. Dothraki outriders let out wild battle cries, spurring their horses. Margaery's pulse thundered in her ears. She tugged her reins, guiding her mare slightly behind the Unsullied line. Around her, Tyrell men drew swords and raised shields, scanning the treetops for glimpses of the enemy. A clarion horn sounded from further up the slope. Then, men in crimson and gold Lannister livery burst out of the foliage, charging down the hill, swords and spears glinting in the afternoon light. They numbered perhaps 200 or 300, a small force by the standards of a full army, but enough to cause chaos if well commanded. "Steady!" Grey Worm shouted, and the Unsullied braced their spears. The Lannister footmen who reached the formation crashed upon the disciplined ranks like waves against a breakwater. quickly losing momentum as the Unsullied methodically defended. The clash of steel echoed through the valley. A horse screamed. Margaery felt her heart pound. She was no stranger to danger, but open battle had a way of turning one's bones to ice. From the ridge above, a thunderous roar erupted. Khal Drogo led a flank of Dothraki screamers who galloped down with reckless speed, swinging rocks overhead. The Lannister lines wavered, caught between the Unsullied and the onrushing cavalry. The trap was perfect. The Lannisters tried to form up, but the Dothraki did not fight in neat ranks. They swarmed among the trees, cutting off escape routes and cutting down archers. Margaery caught a glimpse of a Lannister captain attempting to rally his men, only to be unhorsed by a Dothraki rider's whip. Blood and dust filled the air. Daenerys had not yet unleashed her dragons, though Drogon circled overhead. She remained near the safety of the Unsullied, listening for any sign that the battle might turn. In a matter of minutes, it became clear that the Lannister ambushers were outmatched. Some tried to flee back into the woods, only to find Dothraki outriders waiting. Others threw down their weapons and attempted to surrender. Daenerys, at Margaery's urging, signaled for Grey Worm to accept surrenders rather than slaughter them. The Lannister soldiers who tossed aside their swords were quickly seized. By the time the dust settled, bodies lay strewn across the hillside, and the Rose Road was spattered with gore. Margaery dismounted, her stomach churning at the sight of so much death. She reminded herself that these men had come to kill them, and that letting them strike first would have cost more lives. Still, it was grim work. She saw Daenerys' face as the queen surveyed the battlefield. Hard, grim, but resolute. This was not Meereen, where she had tried to curb bloodshed through negotiation. This was open war in Westeros, and both sides would have to accept the price. A few Lannister prisoners, trembling and sweating, were dragged before Daenerys. One of them, a middle-aged knight with bloodied armor, introduced himself as Ser Olyvar Mallory. He pleaded for mercy on behalf of his men. Daenerys regarded him carefully, while Margaery stood at her side. "You sought to ambush us," Daenerys said in a cool voice. "Why should I grant you mercy?" Ser Olyvar swallowed hard. We had orders from Lord Randall Tarly and Lord Jaime Lannister. They commanded us to slow your advance or die trying. Please, we had no choice." "Tarly," Margaery murmured, exchanging a glance with Daenerys. "We expected him to be on our side. Perhaps we miscalculated. Or perhaps he's playing both sides." Daenerys' expression darkened. "I see. Then you may carry a message back to your superiors. If you remain loyal to Cersei, you face the full wrath of the dragon. Surrender and you might live under my reign. But if you continue to harry my forces, I will burn you from the sky." She paused, glancing at Margaery, who gave a slight nod of agreement. "Let them know there is still time to bend the knee." She spared Ser Olyvar's life and that of several others, commanding that they be released on the condition they carry her ultimatum to their lords. The rest of the Lannister survivors were bound as prisoners to be marched north. Margaery sensed the tension rippling through the ranks. Some Dothraki found it strange to let foes go free, but Daenerys insisted. This was not a war of extermination. It was a war to claim the throne, and sometimes mercy could be as powerful as fear. The ambush had been defeated, and the casualties on Daenerys' side were relatively light. A handful of Dothraki wounded, a few Tyrell knights dead or injured, and some unsullied with arrow wounds. Margaery helped oversee a makeshift triage, ensuring the wounded were tended to. Daenerys dismounted and moved among the injured, offering words of comfort. It reminded Margaery of how she had once visited orphanages and hospitals in King's Landing, trying to ease the suffering of the people under the Lannisters. War was cruel, but to see a queen take a personal interest in her soldiers stirred hope in many hearts. They pressed on the following morning, leaving behind the valley and its ghosts. Rain fell in the afternoon, a thin drizzle that slicked the Rose Road and made traveling slow. Tyrion rode up beside Margaery at one point, huddled under a makeshift cloak. "That was a neat little skirmish yesterday," he observed. "I see you convinced Daenerys to show mercy. Perhaps it will bear fruit." Perhaps not. Margaery steadied her mare as they navigated a muddy patch. I believe in giving them a chance to surrender. We don't need to pile bodies to the sky. If we do, we'll be no better than some of our worst predecessors. Tyrion gave a grunt of agreement. Quite so. Still, it's naive to think all will bow. The Tarleys are proud, and Lord Randall is famously rigid in his loyalties, at least loyalty to whatever cause he believes is just. He might have decided that the Targaryens are too foreign, too dangerous. If so, we'll have to face him in earnest. Margaery exhaled. Then we will. And if Tarly insists on fighting, we'll treat him as an enemy. But part of me wonders how Jaime Lannister fits into this. We have so few reports. Last I heard, he was in King's Landing. Why would Tarly be carrying out his orders? Tyrion shrugged. Perhaps Jaime has been sent to rally lords outside the city, or perhaps Tarly is using Jaime's name for legitimacy. Either way, I doubt my brother is sitting idle while we march on the capital. A somber mood fell over them, and the patter of rain on the road filled the silence. Margaery felt a pang at the thought of Jaime Lannister. He had always been an enigma, honorable in some ways, infamous in others. She wondered if he would stand aside to spare the city a bloody siege, or if he would fight to the bitter end for Cersei's sake. The next few days passed without major incident, though they found signs that the Lannisters were clearing out local villages, likely to deny Daenerys' army additional supplies. Still, with the Tyrell wagons, they had ample food. They forded the Blackwater Rush at a shallow crossing, nearly within sight of the city walls. That night, they made camp in rolling fields that had once been farmland. Fires dotted the darkness as thousands of soldiers settled in for what might be the last night before the siege began. The smell of wood smoke clung to the damp air, and an undercurrent of nervous excitement thrummed. Margaery stood on a small rise, gazing east. In the distance, the faintest glow suggested the presence of King's Landing, though the city was still out of sight beyond a series of low hills. Daenerys joined her, wearing a hood against the chill. Drogon's silhouette passed overhead, black wings beating the clouds. "Tomorrow we approach the city," Daenerys said quietly. "I'll send riders with terms for surrender. Will Cersei yield, do you think?" Margaery shook her head slowly. "No, she won't. She despises me, and she won't accept a Targaryen on the throne. If anything, she might try something desperate, like using the wildfire caches." Daenerys' expression hardened. "Then we'll have to be vigilant. I have to trust Tyrion's knowledge of the city's secrets. If we see any sign that Cersei is planning to ignite those stores, I'll unleash the dragons to neutralize them as best I can. But I pray it doesn't come to that." Before dawn broke, Daenerys dispatched a small party under a flag of truce, led by Grey Worm and Tyrion, to deliver an ultimatum at the city gates. Margaery waited in the main camp, tension coiling in her belly. She pictured the Red Keep, the walls, the scorpions that might be mounted to repel dragons. If the Lannisters refused to surrender, the siege could become a brutal affair. Daenerys might be forced to blockade the city, or even lead an assault. Both options risked horrifying casualties among the civilians. That weighed heavily on Margaery's conscience. She knew King's Landing was teeming with the poor, who had no say in who sat the throne. When Tyrion returned just before midday, his face was grave. He dismounted and approached Daenerys and Margaery, shaking droplets of sweat from his brow. The city's gates remain closed. Cersei's banner flies over the Red Keep. We were met by a contingent of Lannister men at the outer gatehouse. They refused to admit us and told us to depart or face death. I saw a fair number of new scorpions mounted atop the walls. They're prepared for dragons, or so they believe. No sign of Jaime, though I suspect he's inside. Daenerys' eyes narrowed. Then we proceed with the blockade. The Iron Fleet should be in Blackwater Bay by now. We'll cut off the Rose Road, the King's Road, and any path leading in or out of the city. They'll have to surrender eventually, unless Cersei has truly lost her mind. A blockade might still cost thousands of lives, Margaery cautioned. We've seen how quickly disease can spread when a city is under siege. The small folk will be the first to suffer. Daenerys' jaw tightened. I know, but a direct assault could kill even more. If they come to reason, we can spare them all. If not..." She trailed off, but the look in her eyes was grim. That afternoon, Daenerys led her army to within sight of the capital's southern walls. Camp was struck again in the open fields, close enough that the towers of the city were visible. Margaery gazed upon the familiar sprawl, the gatehouses, the mud gate, the sloping neighborhoods beyond. Memories surged within her. Her time as queen consort to Tommen, the wedding to Joffrey that never concluded, the imprisonment by the faith militant. So much had happened within those walls. Now she returned as part of a force that threatened to topple the regime that once held her captive. Drogon's roar echoed over the encampment as the dragons circled. The city must have been in uproar, peasants likely shrieking at the sight of 3 massive beasts overhead. On the walls, Lannister banners snapped in the breeze. No sign of an attempt at parley. Tyrion carefully scouted the approach, noting the new scorpions loaded with giant bolts. He warned that the dragons were not invulnerable, and Daenerys acknowledged that caution. She would not mount a reckless aerial assault. Days turned to a week as the siege began in earnest. The roads were sealed off by Daenerys' forces, and the Iron Fleet patrolled the bay. Yara's ships easily brushed aside the few Lannister galleys that attempted to escape. Refugees who tried to flee the city found no passage. Each day, Daenerys sent word that she would accept surrender on lenient terms. Cersei could step down, Tommen would be spared, and the city's population would be fed. Each day, no reply came. Rumors trickled out. Cersei was holed up with Qyburn, her sinister advisor, planning some monstrous defense. Jaime was nowhere to be seen. The common folk were beginning to panic. Margaery walked the perimeter each day, reassuring the Tyrell Knights that a peaceful outcome was still possible. She set up small relief stations for refugees that slipped out from back gates and were caught by her outriders. Those civilians were fed and told to remain peacefully in camps near the Tyrell wagons. But it was a pittance compared to the throngs still trapped inside the walls. One evening, she and Daenerys stood atop a hill that offered a panoramic view of the city's silhouette against the setting sun. A hush lay over the fields, marred only by the flicker of distant campfires. "I can't stand this waiting," Daenerys murmured. "Each day they refuse, the people suffer. I want to end Cersei's reign without burning King's Landing to the ground." "But how?" Margaery's thoughts churned. "We might attempt a covert approach and infiltration. If we can remove Cersei from power, the rest of the city might surrender. But infiltrating the Red Keep is a deadly gamble. She has the Mountain, Ser Gregor, by her side, and the Gold Cloaks loyal to her. We'd lose many men in a direct infiltration." Daenerys stared at the battlements. "Could we reason with Jaime Lannister? If he is inside, maybe he would see sense. I know Tyrion believes his brother is not entirely lost to Cersei's madness." "It might be worth trying," Margaery agreed. "But how to get a message to him?" They called Tyrion, and he proposed smuggling a letter via Varys' network of little birds, or possibly using his old secret ways into the city. Daenerys endorsed the idea at once, though she insisted that Tyrion and any infiltration team remain as safe as possible. If they could get Jaime to overthrow Cersei from within, it might all end without a single dragon's flame on the city. By the next night, Tyrion's plan was in motion. Using an abandoned passage that once served as a smuggler's route to the Red Keep's dungeons, Tyrion, disguised in a hooded cloak, slipped into the city with a handful of trusted men. Margaery waited anxiously in the siege camp, pacing the floors of her tent, half expecting to hear that Tyrion had been captured or killed. The hours dragged on and dawn approached. Then, a lone rider galloped into camp. It was one of Tyrion's men. He carried a note, scrawled in Tyrion's distinctive hand. "Meeting Jaime soon. Don't lose hope." 2 more tense days passed. Cersei still did not yield. Margaery busied herself with administrative tasks, but she could not quell her anxiety. Daenerys grew restless, sending scouts to watch for any sign that Tyrion's infiltration had succeeded. On the 3rd morning, as sunlight crept across the dew-laden grass, a horn blew at the southwestern corner of the city walls. Margaery rushed to a vantage point, squinting to see what was happening. There, in the distance, a flurry of activity stirred. Figures scrambled along the battlements. Then, unbelievably, the gates began to open. A small side gate, not the main one. A half-dozen men rode out under a white flag. Daenerys ordered the Unsullied to hold formation, while Margaery and a few knights advanced cautiously to meet them. As they neared, they recognized Tyrion's stocky form in the lead. Behind him rode Jaime Lannister, his face haggard, eyes shadowed. They reined in their horses a short distance from the Tyrell lines. Tyrion raised a hand in cautious greeting. "We have parley." Margaery approached, heart thundering. "Lord Tyrion, Ser Jaime, what is the meaning of this? Has Cersei surrendered?" Jaime's face was pale, streaked with exhaustion. He looked as if he had aged years in a matter of days. "Not willingly," he said, his voice low. "Tyrion convinced me it was the only way to spare the people from annihilation. I confronted Cersei. She refused to yield. She threatened to ignite the wildfire caches beneath the city if I tried to usurp her. It became clear she was beyond reason. So I stopped her." Margaery felt a chill. "How?" Jaime's mouth twisted in a bitter line. "I drew my sword." Gregor intervened. "I killed him, or what was left of him. Then, in the struggle, Cersei tried to flee. She screamed that she would see the city burned before bending the knee. She reached for a torch, tried to order Qyburn to set the wildfire alight. I ran her through." He paused, and in the hush, Margaery could almost hear her own heartbeat. Jaime Lannister had killed his sister, the woman he loved, to save the city from destruction. It was a story reminiscent of how he had once slain the Mad King. A wave of complicated emotion washed over Margaery. Relief that Cersei would no longer threaten them, horror at the bloodshed, pity for Jaime who had made such a dreadful choice. Tyrion spoke softly. "It's done. Cersei is dead." The gold cloaks, once they realized how close they came to a fiery demise, turned on Qyburn. "Jaime has convinced the city guard to open the gates for Daenerys, so long as there is no looting or mass reprisals. The city is hers if she'll have it." Margaery's eyes flicked to Jaime. "And what of Tommen?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly at the memory of the gentle boy king. Jaime closed his eyes. "Tommen is safe if not in shock. He was locked in his chambers by Cersei's command, but I freed him. He doesn't fully understand what's happened, but I told him he would be spared if he laid down the crown. He said he would do whatever it takes to end the suffering." Margaery exhaled, a tear pricking the corner of her eye. "Thank the gods he's still alive." Jaime's gaze drifted to the horizon, where Daenerys' camp stretched. "So that's it, then. I've murdered my sister, just as I murdered the Mad King. And I have no illusions about how I'll be received. Perhaps Daenerys will have me executed for my crimes. Maybe she should." Margaery steadied her voice. "She is not her father. If you helped save the city, she may offer clemency. We'll see that justice is done fairly." Tyrion gave his brother a solemn nod. "Come, let's bring this to the queen. I imagine she's impatient to know the truth." Under the watchful eyes of the Unsullied and Tyrell knights, Jaime and Tyrion were escorted back to Daenerys' command tent. Daenerys stood outside, Drogon perched on a nearby hill, tense and ready to strike if needed. She listened in silence as Tyrion recounted how Jaime had deposed Cersei to prevent the destruction of the city. Jaime knelt, bowing his head, sword laid at Daenerys' feet. "I know you have every reason to hate me," Jaime said in a low voice. "I killed your father. I led battles against your allies. I stood by Cersei as she committed unspeakable acts. But I had to stop her. She would have burned them all." Daenerys studied him, hands clasped. Behind her, Margaery watched with bated breath, well aware that Daenerys' decision now could set the tone for her reign. If she executed Jaime for regicide, half the realm might see it as vindictive or contradictory, given that he had saved the city from Cersei's madness. If she pardoned him, it might show mercy, but at the risk of appearing weak or forgiving too easily. After a moment, Daenerys spoke. "You saved thousands of innocent lives by preventing Cersei from unleashing wildfire. You took a monstrous step in killing your own sister, but it was to stop mass murder. For that, I grant you clemency." She paused, her voice firm. "But you must renounce any claim you have to the offices or lands bestowed by the Lannisters. From this day on, if you serve the realm itself. Should you betray me, I will not spare you again. Do you understand?" Jaime's shoulders sagged in relief. "I understand, Your Grace. Thank you." Daenerys gestured for him to rise. Then her gaze fell upon Tyrion. "You have served me well, Tyrion, though I never expected you to arrange the downfall of your own sister in quite this way. You have my gratitude. Now we must enter the city and restore order." Margaery approached, placing a hand gently on Daenerys' forearm. "Your Grace, the small folk will be terrified. We should let them know you come in peace, not to pillage. Let's bring the Tyrell wagons of bread to the main gate. Distribute it openly so the people see your mercy." A faint smile curved Daenerys' lips. "Yes, do it. Let them see this is a new beginning." Thus, that very day, Daenerys Targaryen's army entered King's Landing not as ravaging conquerors, but as liberators. The gates opened, and columns of Unsullied marched in perfect formation, flanked by ranks of Tyrell knights bearing the banners of the Rose and the Dragon. Dothraki horsemen rode at a controlled pace, mindful not to incite panic. Overhead, Drogon loosed a mighty roar, but no flames. The city's inhabitants lined the streets in wary silence, many of them gaunt from fear, many trembling at the sight of foreign soldiers. But when they saw wagons full of bread, fruit, and dried meats being handed out freely, some began to cheer tentatively. Others knelt, uncertain yet relieved that the rumored Dragon Queen was not slaughtering them. Daenerys herself rode near the front, Margaery at her side. Missandei followed on horseback, along with Ser Barristan and Grey Worm. Tyrion and Jaime rode further back, an uneasy symbol of the alliance that had cost so many lives. The party passed through Flea Bottom, where children in tattered clothes stared at the dragons with eyes like saucers. Margaery's gaze swept over the cramped alleys, the same place she had once visited under the watchful eye of the faith militant, trying to feed the hungry. Now she hoped they might find real relief if Daenerys' rule proved benevolent. They ascended the winding streets toward the Red Keep, where the Great Hall awaited. Outside, the Gold Cloaks had laid down their weapons at Jaime's order, along with the last few pockets of defenders who realized resistance was futile. Daenerys dismounted at the keep's courtyard. There stood Tommen Baratheon, flanked by a handful of frightened courtiers. He looked as though he had aged a year in a week. His golden hair was disheveled, and his face tear-streaked. His mother was dead, killed by his own uncle. He gazed at Daenerys with trembling lips. "Your Grace," he said in a quavering tone. I never wanted any of this. If abdicating ends the suffering, then I yield the throne to you." Daenerys' eyes softened with sympathy for the boy king. She stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then it is done. You will have a place in this new order, Tommen. I do not hold you responsible for your mother's crimes." She glanced at Margaery, who nodded, tears in her own eyes. Margaery had grown fond of Tommen's gentleness, however ill-suited he was to rule. Tommen let out a sob of relief, sagging into a nearby retainer's arms. The gathered courtiers murmured, uncertain of their future, but Daenerys' voice rose, clear and steady, cutting through the hush. "Lords and ladies of King's Landing, hear me. I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, the first of my name, breaker of chains, and your rightful queen. I have come not to destroy you, but to deliver you from the cruelty that has plagued this city. From this day forward, the Iron Throne stands under new rule, a rule of justice, mercy, and unity. The war is ended. We will feed the hungry and punish the guilty. Those who bend the knee will be spared. Those who cling to tyranny will face the dragon's wrath." A stir passed through the crowd, a mix of awe and gratitude, fear and relief. Margaery felt the hair on her arms rise. This was the moment they had dreamed of back in Meereen, a peaceful capitulation more or less of the capital. a chance to begin anew without incinerating the city. She stepped to Daenerys' side and spoke in a ringing tone. "Hear the words of your queen. The Tyrells stand with her. The might of the Reach stands with her. Let no man doubt that this is the will of the realm's greatest houses. Our queen demands order, and we shall see it done." Then, amid the tension, Tyrion stepped forward, ever the showman. He gestured dramatically. "Would you deny the dragons after all that's happened? I, Tyrion Lannister, do proclaim my loyalty to Queen Daenerys Targaryen. May her reign be long, and may she bring the justice this city has so often been denied." A ripple of voices swelled, some chanting Daenerys' name. Others murmured that it was the end of the Baratheon Lannister line. Still others simply wept in relief that the dreaded battle had been averted. The city guard began removing Lannister banners, rolling them up as Targaryen sigils were brought out from the wagons. Cersei's reign was over, and Tommen's short rule ended by his own abdication. In the days that followed, Daenerys set about reorganizing the capital. The Red Keep was swept for hidden caches of wildfire, which Qyburn had indeed prepared under the floors of certain corridors. The small folk began receiving rations from the Tyrell shipments, and Margaery oversaw the distribution personally. She made sure that houses once loyal to the Lannisters were given the chance to swear fealty anew rather than be exiled or punished without cause. Meanwhile, the city breathed a collective sigh of relief, though the scars of the war remained. Daenerys was formally crowned in a grand ceremony held in the throne room, with the Iron Throne itself repaired and polished. Drogon, Regal, and Viserion perched on the keep's battlements, visible through the tall windows. Lords and ladies of the realm gathered to witness this unprecedented event, the crowning of a Targaryen queen who had come not through wanton destruction but through alliances and strategic mercy. Margaery stood at her side, wearing regal Tyrell attire, her hair coiled in a crown of golden braids, symbolizing House Tyrell's partnership in this new era. Tyrion acted as Hand of the Queen, fitting the crown upon Daenerys' head with solemnity, while Missandei spoke the formal words of ascension. When Daenerys rose, crowned as the rightful queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, the hall erupted in a cacophony of cheers and applause. Margaery felt a swell of pride, remembering their earliest days in Meereen when everything had been so precarious. Now, the vision of a queen's bloc was a reality. They had ended Lannister dominance, forging a new path forward. In her first act as queen, Daenerys issued a proclamation. The relief effort would continue in King's Landing, with bread distributed freely for as long as it took to stabilize the city. She also declared a general amnesty for all those who had served under the Lannisters, provided they took an oath of loyalty and had not committed atrocities. Certain individuals, such as Qyburn, who was found cowering in a secret chamber with bizarre instruments, were swiftly punished. Jaime Lannister was publicly pardoned for slaying Cersei, though he insisted on relinquishing all rights to Casterly Rock. Tommen, still reeling from the loss of his mother, was placed under Margaery's guardianship temporarily, until a suitable arrangement for his future could be made. In the weeks that followed, the great families of Westeros sent envoys to King's Landing, each declaring fealty or at least acceptance of Daenerys' rule. The Riverlands, devastated by the frays and the wars, sought relief and new leadership. Dorne, under Illyria and the Sand Snakes, affirmed their alliance, though they demanded recognition of certain Dornish customs. The Iron Islands, having pledged to Yara, reaffirmed their vow to cease raiding in return for certain freedoms at sea. In the north, Jon Snow had been declared king in the north by some, but his stance toward Daenerys remained uncertain, overshadowed by the battles with the Boltons and the rumored threat beyond the Wall. Daenerys decided to send an envoy north to treat with Jon Snow, if only to ensure the realm remained united. While Daenerys focused on matters of state, Margaery worked tirelessly to restore civil institutions in King's Landing, reopening the City Watch under new leadership, bringing Septons back to the Great September if they wished to preach peace rather than fanaticism, and reorganizing the distribution of grain so the black market could not exploit the poorest. Her presence became a reassuring symbol for many, a queen's ally who understood the city's needs and did not rule through fear. Whispers spread that Margaery Tyrell was the people's queen, though she did not bear the crown herself. She remained devoted to Daenerys' cause, seeing in her a kindred spirit who had risked much to claim her birthright. Late one evening, after a long day of audiences and decrees, Daenerys and Margaery found themselves alone in a small solar overlooking the city. The open window admitted a mild breeze carrying the smell of the Blackwater. Candles flickered on a table strewn with scrolls. They sipped cups of wine in weary silence. Margaery finally spoke, her voice soft. "It's strange. We've come so far, and yet there's still so much work ahead. Your realm is vast, Your Grace. The North remains unsettled. The Stormlands may need reassurance, and even within the city, there are countless problems. But we've done it, haven't we? We ended Cersei's tyranny without destroying King's Landing." Daenerys studied the wine in her goblet, a thoughtful look on her face. "Yes, it was not how I expected. If Jaime had not turned against Cersei, if Tyrion's plan had failed, we might be standing in a city of ash and bones right now. It makes me wonder if the gods watched over us, or if it was simply our alliances, our Queen's Bloc, as you once called it, that saved the day." Margaery reached out, resting a hand on Daenerys' arm. "Perhaps both. I won't deny that fortune played a role, but so did your willingness to show mercy, your refusal to become the tyrant your father was. And so did the alliances we forged along the way." Daenerys placed her hand over Margaery's, meeting her gaze. "You helped me see another path, Margaery Tyrell. You showed me that we could win hearts as well as battles. I am grateful. I hope you'll remain by my side, as Queen's Counselor, to help me rebuild this realm." Margaery smiled, her eyes sparkling. "Nothing would please me more, Your Grace. I meant what I said in Meereen. We can shape a better future for Westeros." They lingered there, two queens in spirit, if not in title. Outside, King's Landing stretched in a tapestry of rooftops and flickering lanterns, battered but not burned, on the cusp of a new era. Tomorrow, letters would be written, decrees would be finalized, armies would be redirected, but tonight they savored a rare moment of peace. Days became weeks, and King's Landing began to transform under Daenerys' rule. She insisted on hearing grievances personally in the throne room, just as she had once done in Meereen. Margaery advised her on Westerosi customs and local power dynamics, ensuring that newly promoted city watch captains came from families not tied too closely to the old regime. The results were mixed. Some entrenched elites bristled at the Queen's apparent egalitarian leanings, but many commoners embraced the new reign, grateful that grain prices stabilized and that the Knights were no longer plagued by roving thugs emboldened by the Lannisters' chaos. Olenna Tyrell eventually traveled from Highgarden to witness Daenerys' coronation and secure certain formalities for the Reach. She eyed the Queen with her usual sharpness, but Margaery could tell that her grandmother approved of the practical results so far. "You haven't burned the city," Olenna remarked drily over a private supper with Margaery. "That's an accomplishment these days." Meanwhile, Yara Greyjoy and Illyria Sand made appearances at court, each angling for their own interests. Yara wanted trade rights for the Iron Islands. Illyria sought redress for the years of Lannister influence in Dorne. Daenerys, guided by Tyrion and Margaery, granted them measured concessions without ceding too much ground. Little by little, a patchwork of alliances emerged, each thread woven by necessity or mutual gain. It was the fragile start of a united realm, if only the North could be brought into the fold without conflict. Soon, word arrived from the North that Jon Snow had defeated the Boltons at Winterfell. He was rumored to be king in the North, supported by many of the northern houses. Daenerys decided to send an emissary, perhaps Margaery herself, accompanied by a small retinue, to treat with Jon Snow and invite him to bend the knee or at least forge an alliance. Tyrion and Margaery debated the best approach. The North had never loved the Lannisters or the Targaryens, so courtesy and promises of aid against rumored threats beyond the wall might be the key. "Though we must not forget," Tyrion reminded them quietly one evening, "that winter is here. The snows will soon make travel all but impossible. If there really is a threat of White Walkers, we do well to see the North as an ally rather than a rebellious province." Margaery stood at the windows of the Red Keep, gazing at the gathering clouds in the sky. I'll go if you wish it, your grace. But can we afford to have me away for so long, when we're still establishing order in the city? Daenerys considered. Perhaps you should remain here. I need you by my side to solidify the throne's position. I can send another trusted emissary, Missandei, or perhaps Ser Barristan. But Missandei is from Noth. The northern lords might not heed her counsel. Ser Barristan is revered, but he's of the old guard. Maybe the best approach is to let Tyrion go. He is a Lannister, but one who is well known for his break from his family. The northern lords might find that curious enough to warrant a meeting. Margaery nodded. Yes, that might be best. Tyrion is cunning with words. He might persuade Jon Snow of our goodwill. So, as the realm settled into a kind of uneasy peace, Tyrion departed for the north with a small entourage, carrying letters from Daenerys affirming her desire to unite the kingdom in the face of any threat. Margaery remained in King's Landing, presiding over the capital's day-to-day governance alongside Daenerys. People soon spoke of the two queens ruling in tandem, though Margaery herself denied any formal claim to a crown. She was content that House Tyrell had secured a place of honor and influence without overshadowing Daenerys' rightful status. In private, Daenerys once asked her, "Do you miss being queen consort, as you were with Tommen or even Joffrey?" Margaery laughed softly. With Joffrey? Never. That was a nightmare. Tommen was sweet, but that arrangement always felt forced. What I have now is so much more real partnership, real purpose. I wouldn't trade it for any crown in the world. Their bond grew, forged by shared ambition and tempered by the necessity of ruling a complicated realm. When trouble flared in the Stormlands, Margaery and Daenerys would strategize together, dispatching diplomatic missions or small squads of Unsullied to quell unrest. When plague threatened to break out in the cramped alleys of Flea Bottom, they coordinated with the city's healers to establish quarantines. Each success knit the city closer to their cause. Each failure taught them how to do better. It was not all smooth, of course. Discontent simmered in certain quarters. Former Lannister loyalists whispered that the new queen was as foreign as her father. Radical elements of the faith militant, though decapitated by the fall of the High Sparrow, occasionally incited small riots. Yet each time, Daenerys responded with a blend of firmness and mercy, guided by Margaery's insights into the hearts of the people. Eventually, a new Great Council was called, inviting representatives from every major house to attend in King's Landing. Margaery oversaw the seating arrangements, mindful of the long-standing rivalries between houses like Tarly, Florent, and Fossaway. She noticed that Randyll Tarly himself had not yet appeared. Rumors suggested he was bitter over Daenerys' ascendancy, especially since he had attempted that ambush on the Rose Road. But with the Lannisters disempowered, and his ambush thoroughly foiled, Tarly's options were limited. Word then arrived that Randyll Tarly had mustered troops near Horn Hill and was refusing to swear fealty. Daenerys called a council in her throne room, summoning Margaery, Grey Worm, and the Tyrell bannermen. Margaery stood by the queen's side, swirling with frustration. "He should know better," she murmured. "He's had ample opportunity to yield. Why continue this madness?" Ser Devran Fossaway stepped forward. "My queen, Tarly is a proud man. He has always disdained foreign influence. Perhaps if we march on Horn Hill, he'll break rather than watch his home be destroyed." Daenerys' face was unreadable. "I tire of war, but we cannot allow open defiance in the Reach. House Tyrell, what would you advise?" She looked to Margaery. Margaery pressed her lips together. "If Tarly remains adamant, he may try to rally other discontented lords. We must stop that before it grows. But let's give him one last chance. I propose we send an ultimatum, signed by both you and the Tyrell family, urging him to come to King's Landing, swear his loyalty, and resume his place among the lords of the Reach. If he refuses, then we'll have to deal with him as a rebel. But I'd rather avoid bloodshed if we can." Daenerys nodded. "So be it. Draft the ultimatum. I'll have Grey Worm stand ready, should Tarly remain stubborn." The letter was sent, sealed with the dragon and the rose. Tarly's reply came swiftly. a terse declaration that he would never bow to a Targaryen usurper nor a Tyrell he considered complicit in foreign infiltration. Margaery read the words with a sinking feeling. As she presented the letter to Daenerys, she sighed. He calls me a traitor to the Reach for aligning with you. That's nonsense, but he believes it. I'm afraid we have no choice. Daenerys's eyes flicked over the parchment, her jaw tight. We will march on Horn Hill, but we will not burn it. The moment Tarly offers surrender, we accept it. I will not punish his family or his household if they stand down. Grey Worm assembled a contingent of Unsullied and Tyrell knights to ride out under Daenerys's command. Drogon flew overhead, a black shadow over the fields. Margaery accompanied them, riding at Daenerys's side. They found Tarly's forces arrayed near the rolling hills around Horn Hill, a patchwork of local bannermen loyal to Tarly, numbering a few thousand. By comparison, Daenerys's host far outmatched them. Yet Tarly set his men in battle formation, determined to resist. In a final attempt at negotiation, Daenerys sent Margaery forward under a flag of truce to speak with Randyll Tarly personally. They met in a clearing, with Tarly mounted on a powerful charger, Margaery on her mare. The tension was palpable. Tarly was a tall, imposing man with a stern, weathered face and an iron sense of discipline. He regarded Margaery with open contempt. You've dragged the Reach into the hands of a Targaryen foreigner, he said coldly. Our ancestors swore fealty to the Tyrells, but never to become thralls of dragons. Will not yield. Margaery's voice was calm, though her heart pounded. My lord, the war is over. Cersei is dead. King's Landing is at peace. The realm is unifying. Why spill more blood here in your own lands? Swear fealty, and the queen will be merciful. Tarly sneered. Merciful? The Targaryen dynasty was built on fire and blood. I have no illusions about her dragons, or about your little grasp for power. I have my honor. If the rest of the Reach is too weak to see it, I'll stand alone. Margaery's chest constricted. She saw in him the unwavering stubbornness that had made him a great commander, but also a fool in the face of overwhelming odds. Then you leave me no choice, she whispered. When this is over, I'll see that your family is spared, if they choose to renounce your rebellion. That's all I can promise. She turned and rode back to Daenerys, shaking her head. He won't listen. Daenerys's expression turned steely. She raised her arm, giving the signal. The Unsullied advanced with impeccable discipline. Dothraki outriders flanked them, though fewer than in the main army. Tarly's men put up a brave defense, but they were simply outmatched. Even without the dragons breathing fire, the lines broke under the superior tactics of Grey Worm's phalanxes and the swift cavalry. Within an hour, the rebel army was in disarray. Randyll Tarly himself was captured, pinned beneath his fallen horse, cursing Daenerys and the Tyrells. In the aftermath, Daenerys stood in the field, dragons perched in the distance, while Tarly was dragged before her. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes burned with defiance. Daenerys offered him one final chance. Bend the knee or face the consequences of treason. He spat at her feet. Margaery closed her eyes for a moment, recalling what had happened to the Tarlys in another timeline, how Samwell had told a tale of them being burned by Daenerys. She knew this had not happened here, but the possibility loomed. Daenerys was not the type to tolerate repeated treachery. Tarly had made his choice. Daenerys, voice cold, pronounced his sentence, death for treason. But she did not command Drogon to burn him alive, as rumor once claimed had happened in another version of events. Instead, she nodded to Grey Worm. The Unsullied captain, grim-faced, drew his sword. Randyll Tarly kept his pride until the end, kneeling only to bare his neck. A single stroke ended his life, and with it the final pocket of resistance in the Reach. Afterward, Margaery stood by Daenerys, the wind lifting strands of her hair as she gazed upon the body of the man she had once known as a proud Tyrell bannerman. She felt a pang of sadness, but also grim relief. The House of Tarly would survive if his heirs swore fealty. The realm would move on. War demanded harsh choices, At least they had not unleashed dragons upon unsuspecting soldiers. When the final rebel banners were lowered, Daenerys turned to the surviving Tarly men who had thrown down their arms. She declared that the Tarly lands would be overseen by a royal steward until Samwell Tarly, the eldest son, could be found and persuaded to return from the citadel, if he wished. If Samwell refused, then another suitable caretaker would be appointed. It was a gesture of measured justice, letting a disinherited son potentially reclaim his family's seat if he proved loyal to the new order. Margaery approved, privately hoping Samwell might do so for the sake of his family's name. They returned to King's Landing, where the final touches on a more stable government were falling into place. The Great Council convened, with lords from every corner of the realm, most kneeling happily now that the last vestiges of Lannister terror and Tarly rebellion were dealt with. Yara Greyjoy reaffirmed her vow to cease raiding. Illyria Sand offered a grudging but polite courtesy, satisfied that the Lannisters who had wronged Dorne were gone. The new Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, Gendry Baratheon, recently acknowledged as Robert's bastard son and elevated by Daenerys in a surprising twist, pledged fealty in exchange for recognition of his heritage. The North's relationship remained to be hashed out, pending Tyrion's negotiations with Jon Snow. But for the moment, the capital and the southern kingdoms were united under the banner of the dragon, supported by the Rose. On the day the Great Council concluded, Daenerys and Margaery emerged onto a balcony overlooking the Red Keep's courtyard, greeted by cheers from the assembled crowd. The city was healing from the war, though signs of turmoil still lingered. Carpenters hammered at collapsed roofs, scribes busily recorded new laws, children ran through the streets with better prospects of a meal than they had known in years. Daenerys raised a hand in a gesture of acknowledgement, her silver hair catching the sunlight. Margaery stood just behind her, the gold rose clasp in her hair, a sign of her heritage and her alliance. They exchanged a glance, each understanding the gravity of this moment. They had forged a queen's bloc that spanned continents. They had navigated a labyrinth of politics, war, and betrayal to seize the Iron Throne without leaving the city in ashes. A new page had turned in the history of Westeros, a page that spoke of dragons and roses, of cunning alliances and merciful rulership. The challenges ahead remained vast, looming northern winters, potential threats from the east, the day-to-day task of managing a realm scarred by relentless conflict. But for now, the greatest battle was won. In the hush that followed the cheers, Daenerys spoke in a clear, carrying voice. "People of King's Landing, people of Westeros, we stand upon the threshold of a new era. No longer shall you suffer under tyrants who care only for their own power. We vow to protect you, to feed you, to govern with wisdom and justice. House Tyrell stands with House Targaryen, as do our allies across the realm. Let this be the start of a brighter future." Margaery felt a swell of emotion. She remembered standing on a balcony in Highgarden, gazing at blooming roses, longing for a realm at peace. The dream was not yet fully realized, but it was closer than ever. She cast her gaze over the crowd, the Red Keep's ramparts, and the shimmering vista of the city. This was what it meant to shape destiny, to harness cunning, compassion, and strength in equal measure. In that moment, she believed wholeheartedly that Daenerys Targaryen and Margaery Tyrell, the two queens of a new age, might just succeed in remaking Westeros for the better. They had done what no one else had managed in the endless wars. Conquered King's Landing without setting it aflame, unseated the Lannisters without an endless cycle of retribution, united the southern kingdoms under a single banner. Every day, the alliance grew stronger, buttressed by the grain and gold of the Reach, by the fearsome discipline of the Unsullied, by the unstoppable might of dragons, and by the subtle arts of diplomacy that Margaery had honed for years. Where one queen might have faltered, two queens together had prevailed. It was an unprecedented partnership. In the days and months that followed, as the realm inched toward true peace, people throughout Westeros began to whisper about the Queen's Bloc, a phrase that once had been uttered only behind closed doors, now repeated openly in taverns and great halls. Bards sang ballads of how the Rose met the dragon, forging a bond that overcame famine, fear, and the toxic legacies of prior dynasties. In time, as new challenges arose, be they from beyond the sea or from the frozen north, Westeros would learn that unity, tempered by wise counsel and bold leadership, was stronger than any single house could be alone. And at the heart of that unity stood Daenerys Targaryen, crowned queen of the realm, and Margaery Tyrell, her steadfast ally and the living embodiment of the realm's most fertile and hospitable region, joined in a vision of a future where the old cycles of betrayal and brutality might finally be broken. Sometimes, at twilight, Margaery would walk with Daenerys along the Red Keep's outer ramparts, marveling at the city's glimmering lights far below. They would speak softly of the next tasks, reorganizing the King's or Queen's Council, building new alliances with the North, perhaps even forging a grand reformation of the kingdoms into a more cohesive system of governance. Occasionally, Missandei, Grey Worm, or Tyrion would join them, each voicing ideas and concerns. But inevitably, the two queens would find a moment to themselves, silhouettes against the dusky sky, and reflect on how everything had begun. An exiled Targaryen princess in Essos, and a Tyrell maiden surviving King's Landing's intrigues, worlds apart yet united by ambition and necessity. They had forged something extraordinary, a partnership that might outlast them both. In the tapestry of Westeros's history, it would stand out as a moment when cunning and compassion, fire and bloom, united to bring forth a new dawn. For if dragons could soar in the western skies, guided by a queen's righteous will, and if roses could flourish in the same realm, tended by a hand that knew the people's hearts, then perhaps the Seven Kingdoms had a chance at lasting prosperity. And that hope, above all else, was the legacy of Margaery Tyrell joining Daenerys Targaryen early, forging a powerful queen's bloc that changed the shape of history.